this hour, the second volume of his memoir, The Second World War, Winston Churchill wrote, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." From the moment war was declared, the German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, waged a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare against Britain and Allied shipping in the Atlantic. Being a small island nation, Britain was dependent on foreign imports for nearly 70% of its food, and the campaign was intended to starve the British into submission and bring them to the negotiating table. The ensuing naval struggle, known as the Battle of the Atlantic, would be the single longest continuous campaign of the Second World War. At the start of the war, the Royal Navy was ill-equipped to deal with the U-boat menace, having relatively few destroyers and aircraft carriers with which to escort and protect merchant shipping. Weapons and tactics were also largely inadequate, with most U-boats being able to dive and slip away long before any attack could be brought to bear. Furthermore, the limited range of Allied aircraft resulted in a vast 600-kilometre-wide area of Greenland known as the Mid-Atlantic Gap, or the Black Gap, over which air cover could not be provided. To get around these limitations, the Admiralty resurrected the World War I-era convoy system, gathering merchant ships into groups of around 30 to 70 before shepherding them across the Atlantic. While at first glance this practice might seem like it would just create a juicier target for the U-boats, there was a method to the madness. In the pre-convoy system, when each ship had to plot its own independent course across the Atlantic, the chances of a given U-boat randomly stumbling across a ship were relatively high. In the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean, however, even a convoy of 70 ships presented a target not much larger than a single ship, making them harder to find. Plus, grouping ships together made it much easier for a small number of escort vessels to protect the convoy. The system proved surprisingly effective, with less than 30% of the some 2,700 Allied ships sunk by U-boats during the war being torpedoed by the convoy. Yet despite this, the situation for the British was about to become even worse. With the capitulation of France in June of 1940, the Kriegsmarine gains access to ports along the Atlantic coast, meaning that U-boats no longer had to make the long voyage from bases on Germany's Baltic coast through the North Sea and into the Atlantic. Sailing from fortified bases at Brest in Oregon and La Rochelle between July and October 1940, the U-boats launched a new offensive, which they sunk and France also brought with it a brand new menace from the air. Originally designed as an airliner for Lufthansa, the 200 Condor was rather in 1938 a long-range transport and maritime patrol aircraft. Operating from Bordeaux-Merignac Airport on the coast of France, Condors could fly up to 3,500 kilometres out over the Atlantic to track down Allied convoys, which would then need radio in to waiting U-boats or attack directly up to less than 2 kilograms of bombs. Due to the lack of heavy anti-aircraft guns on the merchantmen and their escorts, the Condors could attack with impunity, and between June 1940 and February 1941, they sank an estimated 500,000 tons of Allied shipping, leading Winston Churchill to dub the aircraft the Scourge of the Atlantic. The Admiralty scrambled to find a suitable countermeasure to this new threat. Eventually, two methods were proposed by Captain M.S. Slattery of the Royal Navy: the fitting of the simplest possible flight decks, landing equipment, or the fitting of catapults to suitable merchant ships. The first of these, the fitting of flight decks to merchant ships to form makeshift escort carriers, was the preferred option, but would take some time to implement. Unable to wait as a stopgap measure, the Admiralty approved the development of catapult aircraft merchantmen, or CAM ships, one of the strangest naval weapons of the Second World War. CAM ships consisted of a merchant vessel with a 23-metre-long rocket-powered catapult fitted to their bows, on which was carried a single Hawker Hurricane fighter, affectionately known as a Hurricat. Otherwise unarmed CAM ships would operate as ordinary merchantmen, with one or two being assigned to each convoy. Pilots were drawn from the Royal Air Force and formed as the Merchant Service Fighter Unit, or MSFU, under the command of Wing Commander E.S. Walton Barrett at RF Spec, Liverpool. MSFU pilots signed on as civilian members of the ship's crews under the direct authority of the ship's master, with each vessel's chief engineer and first mate being placed in charge of naval operations. When an enemy aircraft was spotted, a pilot would climb into the Hurricane and rocket off the catapult to either shoot it down or chase it away. The Condor was a slow and cumbersome aircraft, making it easy to brain. But as you might have already realised, with this mission now complete, the pilot now faced a rather grim prospect. With no land around for thousands of miles and no aircraft carriers in the convoy, his only means of returning home would be to bail out in the ocean and wait to be picked up by a member of the convoy. The waters of the North Atlantic being only a few degrees above freezing, well, time was of the essence. And if the convoy then came under attack by U-boats or more aircraft, the pilot's chances of survival were next to nil. The camp ships truly were a weapon of desperation. Nonetheless, by May 1941, 35 merchant vessels had been converted to camp ships and assigned to Atlantic and Arctic convoy duty. In addition, 5 older naval vessels were converted to dedicated fighter catapult ships crewed by Royal Navy personnel. These were the ocean-boarding vessels Maplin, Araguani, and Patia, the anti-aircraft cruiser Springbank, and the seaplane carrier Pegasus. However, early reports from these vessels were less than encouraging, with the fragile aircraft taking a beating at the hands of the harsh North Atlantic weather. Covers were ripped off, airframe corroded, engine mags and all electrical gear setting up current. In bad weather, inspection and maintenance was impossible, and corrosion was an ever-present problem. And despite being dedicated naval vessels with professional crews, the fighter catapult ships proved alarmingly short-lived, with Patia being bombed and sunk in April, Araguania and Springbank torpedoed in September, and the aging Pegasus retired in April 1942 and used as a catapult training ship. But on August 3, 1941, the remaining vessel, HMS Maplin, became the first fighter catapult ship to successfully engage an enemy aircraft. While steaming to rendezvous with the convoy, the Maplin spotted a single condor approaching and Lieutenant Armour W. They engaged as swift and decisive as ever they tried to forward bow and machine guns.
Oh my god! Ooh, yeah!
The quick takes port and opens up just about being by 5-second burst. This range of my guns burst into flames and spiraled into the water, whereupon Everett managed to ditch his aircraft. Boat from destroyer HMS Wanderer. It was later awarded to distinguished. The first combat action for a civilian camp ship took place on November 1st when the Condor off the western island. However, the aircraft immediately fled upon spotting the first real Kansas. On the 15th, convoy PQ-16, escorted by the camp ship Empire Lawrence, set sail from the west Russia, while simultaneously convoy QB-12, escorted by Empire Lorne, departed from the west. On May 25th, as the two convoys approached one another, the Empire Lawrence spotted an approaching formation of 4 German aircraft, 2 Condors, and 2 Lucas G-8 bombers. The weather was too foggy for the aircraft, so he called the Empire Lorne to pilot officer Amy Kendall rocketed into the air and pressed her. One of the own aircraft was badly damaged in the attack, and as a later Royal Navy report stated, some seconds later the Hurricane was seen to dive perpendicularly into the sea, following immediately by Kendall. Water. Meanwhile, the new formation of PG-111 bombers appeared, forcing pilots and Lawrence to launch into action. Hay succeeded in shooting down one Heinkel and damaging another before being wounded by a cannon shell and forced to bail out. This plane by shrapnel was picked up by the destroyer HMS Volunteer before Estonia. It was later that the cannon shell was wounded and had been fired off by Germans, but an anti-aircraft gun aboard one of the ships. The enemy bombs some 5 merchant ships survived the aircraft. Hurricane pilots would score 4 victories in 1942, one even managing to save his aircraft in the process. On the 18th off the coast of Russia, flying officer took on the tactical PG-111, shooting down one for ammunition. Determined to protect the convoy at all costs, Berlin moved round and dove on formation, a series of unarmed dummy attacks finally managing to drive them away. Then, less than enthusiastic about the prospect of ditching, he turned towards shore and landed in Archangel with fuel left in his tank. By mid-1943, the need for camp ships had come to an end as more and more dedicated pistol carriers available and long-range carrying 24 liberated crossing much in the 8th, the FFXIV was officially disbanded, but Robert Gordon enjoyed one moment of glory. After German military intelligence and understanding of July 28th, the Luftwaffe sent off the Condors to Gibraltar to attack a single convoy. However, other vessels, camp ships, Empire Darwin, Tide, returned to the British Isles to have their catapults removed. On spotting the aircraft, flying officer J.A. Stewart and flying officer P.J.R. Flynn launched into into action, managing to shoot down one Condor and scatter the rest. In the end, the 35 CAM ships and 5 FCS ships converted during the war scored a total of 6 aircraft shot down and 3 damaged, at a cost of 12 ships lost in action. While these numbers may seem the main contribution of the CAM ships was psychological, with their near presence discouraging German aircraft from pressing home their attacks. Within months of the ship's appearance, long-range attacks by Condors dropped to nearly zero. While a crude and dangerous stopgap solution, CAM ships and Hurricanes were instrumental to keeping Britain's vital supply lines open, a testament to British ingenuity, the desperation of the early war years, and the bravery of the pilots who volunteered to fly what they must have known were virtual suicide missions in some cases. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. As always, thank you very much. This video is brought to you by KiwiCo. What does KiwiCo do? Well, I'm going to tell you. They are redefining the future of play with hands-on projects and toys that are designed to expose kids to STEAM concepts. STEAM is like STEM, except it's got art thrown in there as well, because why not? Who doesn't love art? KiwiCo comes as a monthly crate. I have 2 crates in front of me right now. These have all been designed by experts and then tested by kids, which makes a ton of sense. This one's for slightly older kids. This one is for younger kids. I don't have an older kid, I got a younger kid, but we'll look at this one anyway. It's called the Tinker Crate. What you get in here is this is all about constructing something called an infinity mirror. Honestly, I don't know what an infinity mirror is, so I think that makes it more interesting because then I get to learn along with my kid. Now, I have this one here. This is not for me, but for my kid, who is 11 months old. And in here, you get all sorts of cool stuff. Now, I've had several of these before from KiwiCo, and they've been amazing. They come with all of this extra information, so you can read about the toys and games that are included. So this is for 0 to 12 months. You get, like, all of these great... I don't know what this is called. I'm sure these notes would tell me, but my kid will absolutely love this when I take this home today. This is also very smart. I just noticed it's got these suckers on the bottom, because, well, if you've got a kid, you know why. There are 8 different subscription lines for all ages and topics, so you're bound to find something that your child loves. Importantly, everything you need is in the box, so you don't have to go to the store and buy things that you're supposed to have on hand. So go over to the store, find something you think your kid would like. And if you go to kiwico.com/TIFO, you get 50% off your first month of any KiwiCo subscription line. Look, this is really great stuff. If you have a kid of, well, a lot of different ages, they will love it. And let's get into today's video. On December the 13th, 2000, Vice President Al Gore conceded the presidential election to Governor Bush. A day earlier, a lengthy and expensive manual vote recount process in Florida was stopped by the United States Supreme Court, despite Bush leading by only 537 votes. With Bush winning the state's 25 electoral votes, it gave him 275 electoral votes and over the needed threshold. This election result was highly unusual, not just because of Supreme Court decisions and hanging chairs. It was also only the 4th time in United States history that a candidate had garnered a majority of the popular vote, but lost the election. Gore received 50,996,582 votes, and Bush received 50,456,062 votes. Bush won because of the Electoral College system, a much maligned and complex way of determining the future of America. So, how does it work? Why does America use the Electoral College? Why isn't a simple vote count enough to determine the president of the USA? To begin with, contrary to popular belief, when Americans go to the polls to seemingly vote for the next president of the United States, they are, in fact, not actually voting for the president. Rather, they are casting a vote for a group of electors who will then vote for the president as they see fit, to reduce any chance of confusion, rather than having people explicitly vote for the electors on their ballot. The presidential candidate, a given group of electors is pledged to vote for, is put on the ballot instead. Another common misconception about presidential voting in the United States is that the president is elected once the general public's votes are tallied up. Again, because the general public does not technically vote for a president, but rather on which electoral college representatives will get to vote for president, the president isn't officially elected until the following January. Specifically, on January the 6th, the current vice president opens voting during a joint session of Congress. It's during this session that electoral votes are tallied, with the deadline for those to be submitted being late December. This may seem like something of a technicality, but there are many completely legal scenarios in which a different president may be chosen than the one who appears to have won after the general public cast their votes for electors. More on those just in this bit. So, who are these electors who elect presidents? How are they chosen? There are three examples who can be elected. Constitution. No senator or representative or person in office or trust shall be appointed an elector. There's a provision buried in the 14th Amendment that says any state official that was involved in the rebellion against America is also barred from being elected. You could thank the American Civil War for that one. Beyond those two restrictions, anyone can be an elector. As for who ends up being an elector, that depends on the political parties and how a given state legislature sets the method of selection. In a nutshell, each state's political parties nominate electors who are extremely loyal to their respective parties, equal to the number of electoral votes the state has, which in turn is equal to the number of senators per state and the number of representatives determined by population that said state has, or in the case of the District of Columbia, a set of 3 electors, thanks to the 23rd Amendment. There is also potentially one additional minor caveat to consider when the party selects its group of electors. An elector cannot vote for a vice president and president who both are from the elector's home state. This rule was meant to ensure that an elector could not vote for 2 of their state's favourite sons. More on why this was considered so important in a little bit. Lots of reasons to keep watching today. Now today this is obviously not an issue for anyone so long as the presidential candidate picks a vice presidential candidate from another state on their own. The party's candidate the party gets the majority of the state's votes. That's the ones that to vote for the presidents in their respective state. For example, in 2012, Californians voted for the 55 party-selected Democrats who, in turn, lost their 55 votes for the Obama-Biden ticket. And to note here, there are currently 2 exceptions to this all-or-nothing approach. Maine and Nebraska, they both use a distinct system. In this system, the state's popular majority is accounted for in some electors' votes, but others vote based on congressional districts' popular majority within the state. This can potentially result in a split of votes. For instance, in 2002, Nebraska ended up with Democrats. However, as previously alluded to make this even more there are no federal laws or constitutional provisions that require electors to cast their vote in accordance with there are some state laws, however, pertaining to the State and the District of Columbia have laws that require the electors to vote the way the popular vote is instructed them to do. That said, penalties are not too severe in most cases. Failure to adhere to these state laws, like so-called faithless electors, could result in a fine or replacement as an elector. That also leaves 21 states that do not have such laws, allowing electors to vote as they see fit instead of how the general public directed them to do. It turns out this seems to have been what the founders actually intended. It should be noted here that according to the National Archives, more than 99% of the time electors have voted as instructor, and no elector has ever been prosecuted or punished for failing to vote in accordance with the popular vote of their respective states. However, there have been 22 times involving 179 electoral votes that faithless electors have applied to the system. For example, in 2008, when an elector apparently accidentally voted for John Edwards rather than the Democratic nominee Barack Obama. Another notable recent instance was in 2000, when a DC elector abstained from voting in protest over the district's lack of representation in Congress. Despite the occasional faithless elector, to date none of these faithless voters has ever been the deciding vote in an election. However, there have been elections where a single faithless elector could have decided the president, such as in 1876 when Rutherford B. Hayes, despite losing the popular vote, won 185 electoral votes versus 184 to Samuel Tilden. So, why does the United States use the somewhat convoluted Electoral College when a popular vote would be drastically simpler and more democratic? In short, it was a necessary compromise from a time when the United States was not bound nearly as cohesively as it is today, nor were the general public very well educated on the whole or well informed about the various candidates. For the more detailed answer, the Electoral College dates back to 1787's Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where they were given the gargantuan task of figuring out a solution to the mostly ineffective Articles of Confederation. Among the many issues that needed resolving was how the President of the United States was to be elected. In order to understand the delegates' thought process, context is needed. The young country was only 13 states, and residents were generally extremely provincial, meaning they still trusted their own state more than the federal government. Further, in many cases, people identified more as a citizen of their state rather than as a citizen of the United States. From this, the founders were concerned that citizens of each state would put their own best interest before that of the nation. On top of this, because each state's citizens would likely know their own candidates much better than candidates from other states, which they probably wouldn't have heard of, they were doubly likely to vote for their own candidates. The ultimate result of this was feared to be that the winner of each state would likely be a citizen of that state, who would in turn have little chance of winning or even garnering any support at all in other states. This brings us to the first option put on the table: election via popular vote. While more democratic, as mentioned, delegates were very concerned that each state would potentially elect their own candidate, making it difficult to ever get a candidate with wide support throughout the nation. Instead, they feared they'd be left with a field of many favourite sons. Among these favourite sons, the bigger states like Virginia would dominate, resulting in little chance of someone from a smaller state ever becoming president, and making it so Virginia's interest would be disproportionately represented in the nation's highest office. For reference, at the time, Virginia had 424,000 men who were eligible to vote, which was more than Georgia, Delaware, South Carolina, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire combined. The other major option proposed was a single congressional appointment. Despite being inherently non-democratic, there was a thought that the president should be less powerful than Congress and therefore needed to be dependent on. Also, the thinking went the general public was largely extremely poorly educated and poorly politically informed. Congressional members, on the other hand, were not only already elected to represent their respective citizens in such matters, but were also intimately familiar with the respective presidential candidates. Their character, work ethic, political leanings, etc. were generally quite well educated relatively to most people. Congressional members, on the other hand, were not only already elected to represent their respective citizens in such matters, but were also intimately familiar with respective presidential candidates, their character, work ethic, political leanings, etc., and were generally quite well educated relative to most people. Thus, in a nutshell, members of Congress were simply the most qualified to pick the most qualified presidents. Ultimately, this proposal lost because it threatened the checks and balances of federal government. As then delegate and future President James Madison noted, the election of the chief magistrate would agitate and divide the legislature so much that the public interest would materially suffer, and public bodies are always apt to be thrown into contentions that its more violent ones on such occasions, like many others. The candidate would intrigue with the legislature, would derive his appointment from predominant faction, and be apt to render his administration subservient to its views. Essentially, if the president was elected by Congress, while in theory Congress at the time may well have been in a much better position to pick the best president, those who sought the office would be constantly campaigning and trying to impress those members, perhaps even giving favours upon election in exchange for votes. Beyond this, no president interested in getting re-elected could ever oppose Congress for fear that we would re-elect him or her later. Needless to say, the system was ripe for extreme corruption. So, while in theory Congress was best suited to pick the potential best president, in practice they'd likely not have done so, or if they did, lorded too much power over that individual. Thus, the Committee of 11 on Postponed Matters advised to propose the Electoral College, and this delegates ultimately approved. Alexander Hamilton notes of the Electoral College, if the manner of it be not perfect, it is at least excellent. As to what it actually was intended to be, the idea here was essentially something of a cross between popular vote and congressional selection. It is democratic in the sense that the popular vote could potentially determine the state's allegiance. In the beginning, state legislatures didn't sway, but also limits the one state's influence slightly by awarding votes from existing states are elected representatives. As for why it was also partially a compromise for those who advocated for a congressional selection, in a time before political parties in the United States, there is evidence that the founders very much assumed the electors explicitly not hold an office and trust their profit into the United States, avoid at least some of the aforementioned corruption potential. As for why it was also partially a compromise for those who advocated for a congressional selection, in a time before political parties in the United States, there is evidence that the founders very much assumed the electors who explicitly could not hold an office on trust or profit in the United States, avoid at least some of the aforementioned corruption potential, would not be bound by the popular vote in their state or party affiliation or any such similar device. In fact, in the earliest elections, over half the state's legislatures selected their presidential electors with no regard for public vote, a right state legislatures still technically retain, but is a practice that died swiftly around the turn of the 19th century. Beyond potentially disregarding popular vote and selecting which group of electors gets to vote for president, if a given state legislature really wanted to, it would even decide to pick a group of electors via something completely arbitrary, like putting a bunch of mice in a maze, one representing each person who ran for president, with the winning mouse determining which group of electors is chosen. Of course, no state legislature would dream of doing something so outlandish. However, several state legislatures have very recently begun banding together to use their elector picking power to potentially disregard their own citizens' popular choice. A bit more about that in a bit. In any event, by 1790, along with the rest of the Constitution, the Electoral College was ratified by all 13 states, and as in the vast majority of cases, resulted in little controversy or public outcry for a change to the original system. In fact, the Electoral College has undergone only a few small changes since 1790. The most significant change occurred following the election of 1800. At the time, each elector would cast 2 votes, one for one presidential candidate and one for another. The person with the most votes became president, and the person with the second most became vice president. This ensured, at least in theory, the second most qualified individual was vice president, ready to step in should something happen to the most qualified person, the president. Today, the person who potentially would step in should something happen to the president is not selected by members of the Electoral College, nor even by the citizens of the United States, but rather by the president. Senator Samuel White of Delaware noted when the switch was made, the vice president is now chosen not based on the individual's qualifications for that office, but rather by if he, by his name, by his connections, by his wealth, by his political situation, by his influence, or his intrigues, best promotes the election. So what spurred the change in the Electoral College? No easy thing to do, given that it requires an amendment to the Constitution. And it was mainly the rise of political parties. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were both vying for presidents. Each had a third vice president within their own party. Concept. This was a problem if all the electors for a given party ended up voting for both Thomas Jefferson and his vice president, Aaron Burr. If this happens, then both presidents, and well, it certainly happens. What followed was 36 rounds of voting within the House of Tribunal at the time. Party members moneyed things up, voting for Burr just to attempt to see their most rival Jefferson defeated. There were even threats of militias forming to march on the Capitol to push for Jefferson before Jefferson, who was always understood to be his party's choice of president over Burr, was one of the chosen. In the aftermath, the 12th Amendment was passed. This said that each elector got 2 votes as before, but instead of both votes being for a potential president, one would be for president and the other for vice president, thus creating little chance that a vice presidential candidate would be elected president. There's no chance, because, as we've covered before, it can still absolutely happen. Other than that, over 200 years later, the Electoral College is still essentially the same process as it was on day 1. While today it's a bit outdated given American attitudes concerning federal and state allegiances, it is still a process that has survived in no small part because it's both relatively difficult to amend the US Constitution, and on the whole, this seems to work pretty well. We don't really need as much controversy as it would need constitutional change. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you would please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to check out my fantastic sponsor, here we go, link below. Thank you for watching. existing domain, which makes everything super easy to manage. Once you've gone through the super easy customization process, there are no updates, there's no patches, there's no tech BS to deal with. No one comes back. Yes. You know what everyone does like? Squarespace's 24/7 customer support. They're there to help you whenever you've got a question. And Squarespace isn't just about an online presence. You can also totally sell stuff or pursue a dream, etc. Do it with Squarespace. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial. When you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/brainfood and you'll save 10% off the first purchase of a website or a domain. So again, thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring. Check them out through the link below. Let's get into it. Since the early 1970s, conspiracy theorists have created ever more elaborate stories about how NASA faked the moon landings, much to the annoyance of the literal hundreds of thousands of people who weren't in some capacity in reality, even more so to the men who were brave enough to sit in front of a massive controlled explosion, take a little jaunt through the soul-crushing void of space, and their ship was hiding those then get into another spacecraft which was somehow never been test fired before they lit the candle, and all of this was done with the goal of exiting said ship with only a special suit between them and oblivion. And also, don't get us started on the paltry government salary that they earned to do all of this, and the hilarious lengths that they have to go to provide some semblance of a life insurance policy for their families should the worst happen during the missions. So, who first got the idea that the moon landings were faked? While it's highly likely there were at least a few individuals here and there who doubted man could accomplish such a thing, just over half a century after the end of the period in which humans were still pitching up covered wagons, the first to really get the moon landing hoax story going popularly was a writer called Bill Casing. How did he do it? Well, Casing self-published a book in 1976 called We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion swindle. Released a few years after the Apollo 17 mission in 1972, Casing's book popularly introduced some of the most well-known talking points of moon landing deniers, such as that the astronauts should have been killed when they passed through the Van Allen radiation belts, the lack of stars in photographs, the missing blast crater below the lunar modules, etc. Beyond these, he also had some more, let's say, unusual and occasionally offensive assertions, which even the most ardent moon landing denier would probably rather distance themselves from. Not exactly the best seller cases, but nonetheless laid the groundwork for some of what would come after, with the idea further gaining steam in part thanks to the 1978 film Capricorn 1, which shows NASA making a Mars landing and then to great lengths to keep a secret. As for the film, director Peter Hyams states that he first got the idea of such a movie when using the Apollo 11 mission and thinking there was one event that really all supporters that had almost no witnesses, and the only verification we have on a TV camera. Not an accurate statement, the slightest on the latter point, it nonetheless got the wheels turning and he ultimately developed a script based on this information. The story that at least as Casing tells it is that in the late 1950s, the feasibility of man successfully landing on the moon, he concluded, in his own words, that the chance of success was something like 0.0017%. In other words, it was hopeless. Casing doesn't explain how NASA came up with such a precise figure given all of the unknown variables at the time, nor why he would qualify something like followed by such an extremely exact number. He also did not name the report itself. In fact, as far as we can tell, NASA never conducted such an all-encompassing study on the feasibility of a successful moon landing. That report that NASA conducted a feasibility study of the proposed designs for several manned rockets immediately prior to the Apollo program in order to decide which contractor to use. This, of course, has nothing to do with Casing, but we can even mention it as part of the facts, and reading Casing's various works has us cleansed a little by saying things that are actually true. In any event, Casing would later assert that he determined from this report that there's no way that NASA could have improved the 0.0017% odds in the time between the results of this supposed study and the moon landings which occurred about a decade later. Now, if Casing was just some random guy shouting in the wind, it's unlikely anyone would listen to him. Every conspiracy theory origin story needs at least some shred of credibility from the person starting it to really get the fire going. The Casing assertions about the moon landings, this comes in the end of the fact that for a brief period he worked for a rocket company that made rockets for the Apollo program. Not an engineer or having any similar technical expertise whatsoever, Casing's background was primarily in writing, an English degree from the University of Redmond, after which he naturally got a job in furniture. As for the writing he planted with Rocketdyne, his job was initially as a technical writer starting in 1956, and he eventually worked his way up to the head of technical publications. He finally quit in 1963, deciding he had had enough of working for the man. After quitting to quit him the rat race, in 1963, Casing travelled the country in a trailer with his family, earning their living writing books on a variety of topics from motorcycles to farming. This all brings us to 1969, when he, like most everyone else in the world with access to the TV, watched the moon landing. While watching, Casing recalled the supposed NASA study that he'd seen all of those years ago, as well as the engineers he'd worked with at the time in the 1950s, claimed that while the technology existed to get astronauts to the moon, getting them back was actually as possible. He stated, as late as 1967, 3 astronauts died in a horrendous fire on the launch pad, but as of 1969, this suddenly all happened twice. Despite often describing himself as the fastest ever person, conspiracy theories to the world. As for why NASA would bother with the charade, it claims NASA worked in intelligence agency to make the moon landings to while certainly good for the country if they could get away with this, the benefit to NASA itself was, of course, funding. Said Casing, they, both NASA and Rocketdyne, wanted the money to keep pouring in. As to how to do this, goes on, I've worked in aerospace long enough to know that's their goal. So, how does NASA do it? It claims that the footage of the moon landing was actually filmed on a soundstage. When later asked where the soundstage was located, Casing confidently stated that it was located in Area 51. As he's never given proper evidence as to how he knows this, we can only assume it's because a proper space conspiracy isn't complete, so Area 51 is not involved somehow. Casing also claims that the F-1 engines used were too unreliable, so NASA instead put several B-1 rockets inside each of the F-1 engines. Of course, in truth, these wouldn't have been powerful enough to get the Saturn V into orbit, even if its tanks were mostly empty. And with the frosted ice in the 107 Saturn V here, it's apparent tanks were not interested in empty. There's also the little problem that clusters of B-1s and bells working as advertised sight. Nevertheless, despite these problems with this story, he did report that Saturn V was launched to space as shown. In fact, as soon as the rocket was out of sight, it was simply pitched in the ocean and then into space. But listen, you've got to stick with us here because the story has aged a lot over years. Whatever the case, in all initial cases, he claims that the astronauts were not aboard. Now, wondering how the US fought the Soviets and other nations tracking rockets during these missions, he claims that big signals was devised, allowing for tracking stations on Earth to think the craft was headed to the moon, and critically successfully brought the Soviets who were tracking missions back. Alright, so now you might be wondering, well, what did Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins do during the mission if they weren't zipping around space? Well, in the first edition of the Casing claims that they flew to Las Vegas, where they mostly hung out at strip clubs and they rented evidence on the 24th floor of the Sands Hotel. I mean, we really could have made this stuff up, but apparently Casing can. Casing goes on to say that at one point, one of the trio got into a fist fight with someone in broad daylight over a stripper. Sadly, Casing doesn't reveal which of the men did this nor how he knew about it, so we're forced to assume that it was Buzz Aldrin, who is the only member of the three we definitely know has gotten into a fist fight. In this case, in 2002, a 72-year-old Buzz Aldrin punched Bart Searell, who is a We Never Landed on the Moon conspiracy theorist, documentary maker, and cab driver. Searell invited Aldrin to a hotel, with Searell telling him that he was making a children's TV show on space. Once Aldrin arrived at the hotel, Searell pulled out a Bible and tried to get Aldrin to put his hand on it and swear that he had walked on the moon. Needless to say, Aldrin was pretty irritated despite things got Aldrin a liar and a coward, at which point Aldrin punched him. Absolute legend. As goes the defense, Seagull states, when someone has gotten away with a crime, in my opinion, they deserve to be ambushed. I'm a journalist trying to get at the truth. Unwilling to sway on what that truth is, however, Seagull states, I do know the moon landings were faked. I bet my life on it. Not all is lost, however, because he states, I know personally that Trump knows the moon landings are fake and is biding his time to reveal it at the end of his term or at the end of his second term when he's re-elected. So rest easy, everyone. The truth is going to come out soon. Apparently. In any event, going back to Casey's book, he states that shortly before the astronauts were supposed to be broadcasting from the moon, all three men arrived on a soundstage deep within the confines area with one of the sandwiches. He also states that, along with these cheese sandwiches, as provided bucks and sugar girls while they were one. Presumably, this was the only strip clubs. After eating the, no doubt, delicious sandwiches, Aldrin and Armstrong put on some spacesuits and pretended to walk across a fake moon set while reading out some great pacing, well-rehearsed lines in a performance he called Not Great, but Good Enough. This is a misguided considering apparently they've seen every scientist on Earth from then to now, including ones from the nation directly competing with the US to land someone on the moon. That company will relish any opportunity to even allege that the whole mistake is an incredible way, let alone prove it and embarrass the US to the whole world. But unfortunately, as you might imagine, the Soviets at the time were monitoring the whole thing rather closely with their newfangled technology. Not landing this. The fake moon and that there were only a 7 seconds between Armstrong and Aldrin's performances and the broadcast that the world was watching. Thus, had enough fly buzzed across the set, NASA would have only seconds to notice and cut the feed, lest such a mistake or inconsistency be noticed with the footage that people would be watching for the rest of human history. As for the splashdown and re-entry, he claims the astronauts were eventually put on a military cargo plane, a Lockheed C-5 Galaxy, and simply dropped from it in the capsule. As for how he knew this, he did provide a source for once, claiming that an airline pilot he talked to had seen the Apollo 15 module dropped from a cargo plane. Who this pilot was, what airline he worked for, if he offered any evidence to support his claims, such as a flight log showing him piloting a plane in the area during the time of the splashdown of Apollo 15, or even when he talked to said pilot, however, he fails to mention. As for the moon rocks brought back, these were apparently meteorites down from Antarctica, as well as some that were cleverly made in the NASA geology lab. As for how NASA was able to keep their lid on things despite nearly 500,000 people working on the Apollo program in some capacity, not just at NASA, but countless independent organizations, because the NASA simply only let those who really needed to know that the whole thing was a hoax. So following this reasoning, that means all the scientists, engineers, etc. working on all the components and various facets of the mission were genuinely trying to make the moon landing happen, including knowing the requirements that made it happen and testing everything they made until it met those requirements, meaning what was built and was planned should have been capable of doing what the mission required. That said, Casey admits that a handful of people here and there would have had to know the whole thing was a sham, paid them off, and those who couldn't be paid off were promoted or threatened. For those who resisted further, apparently they were even murdered, which is something we're going to get more into shortly. The ridiculousness of these demands, how easily they crumble under the slightest bit of scrutiny, is likely why the 2002 re-release of his original book, Casey changed his story in various ways, including claiming that the engines on the Saturn V actually did work, and that Collins, Aldrin, and Armstrong did go to space after all, instead of going to hang out with strings and Vegas. He then states that all three men orbited the planet while pre-recorded, not live footage, was shown on Earth. This one is, to put it mildly, strained credibility on pretty much everything he said from start to finish, and providing absurdly specific details, generally without bothering to provide any evidence whatsoever backing up these claims, and changing those specific details frequently over time. Casey's book and subsequent work nonetheless helped spawn the still thriving moon landing and conspiracy theory. As for Casey, he didn't stop there. He continued to sporadically come up with new allegations against NASA, including that the agency murdered the astronauts' teacher aboard the Challenger explosion. Why they would do this when the whole Christopher Cole thing was supposed to be a publicity stunt to get the public more interested in space travel science and NASA, Well, that's a bit of a mystery. According to Casey, Christopher McAuliffe, the only civilian and only woman aboard, refused to go along with the lie that you couldn't see stars in space. So they blew her up along with 6 other people to keep that fine for rats. Speaking of things that Casey said that are ridiculously easy, but with even more of effort, we feel obligated to point out that Christopher McAuliffe was not the only woman on board. NASA astronaut Julia Resnick was also killed in that tragedy. Not stopping there, Casey also claimed to be relatively all astronauts were intentional, as one or more of the astronauts aboard was going to blow the whistle on another hoaxman. So obviously to point out here that, as previously mentioned, he also used this fire as evidence of NASA lacking expertise to get a man to the moon, meaning, according to Casey, this fire was somehow both intentional to murder a few astronauts and also accidental, and it was NASA's incompetence. Moving swiftly on, NASA officials also apparently had others killed, including safety inspector at North American Aviation, Thomas Barron, who wrote a report on NASA safety protocol violations on that tragedy Apollo 1 fire. But at this point, we should probably notice that in the 1990s, Casey decided to sue the Bucks. In 1986, someone publicly stated, "This guy is wacky, his decision makes me feel angry. He spent a lot of time getting ready to go to the moon. He spent a lot of money, took great risks, something everyone in this country I will also fix Casey asking you to tear out your manuscript and pursue a project that has some meaning, even legacy. Proud of, not some trash whose readers will be out for the Senate. Unwilling to stand for its meaning and publicly besmirched, Casey naturally sued Lovell for defamation, but the case was eventually dismissed and nothing came of it. Casey continued to assert that the moon landings were a hoax right up until his death in 2005, between writing books on cookery, motorcycle safety, farming, taxes, survival, how to subsist on very little money, and travel guides, as well as making occasional appearances on shows such as Oprah, expounding on his conspiracy theory work. On the side, he also promoted microhousing as a solution for homeless people and ran a cat sanctuary called Flock, standing for the love of cats and kittens. So, yes, Casey was a man whose passions included microhousing, cat survival, travel, living off almost nothing, and rapidly coming up with conspiracy theories. If only he had been born later or the interwebs invented sooner, this man would have been an internet superstar. Whatever the case, Casey's death understandably garnered a mixed reaction from the scientific community, with few finding the ability to muster much sympathy for a man who accused NASA of murdering people. Gone but not forgotten, Casey's ideas have actually gained popularity in recent years, particularly among younger generations, according to various polls, such as one done by space consultant Mary Dittmar in 2005, showing that 25% of people aged 18 to 25 doubted that man had ever walked on the moon. This is all despite the fact that it's never been easier to definitively debunk Casey's various assertions. Meaning countless explanations by scientists definitively addressing point by point every idea and notion put forth by moon landing conspiracy theorists. But there's also the fact that there are literally pictures taken in the last decade showing clear evidence of some of the equipment sitting on the moon, including for the Apollo 11, 14, 15, 16, and 17 landing sites. Even in some cases, these photos showed the tracks left by the astronauts, the shadows, and flags that were planted. Naturally, moon landing deniers simply claim these photos were also faked, although why China, India, and Japan should cater to NASA on this one when they independently took pictures of their own verifying moon landings is anybody's guess. We know much more on all of this in an upcoming video, how we know man really walked on the moon. That's going to be coming real soon, so please do subscribe. Also, please do check out that fantastic sponsor Squarespace. They make these sort of longer videos possible. Find them links to in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching. Guys, today's episode was an absolute beast to make, and it is truly possible because of sponsors like Dollar Shave Club. If you want to support us, Dollar Shave Club is one of the best ways to do that, and you can do it for only $5. Now, I don't use Dollar Shave Club on my beard, but I do use it on my head, and it really is great. I used to buy those really cheap razors from the store, and I don't know why, but they just cut you more. I would end up cutting myself a lot, maybe it's because I can't see my back and stuff like that. Not a problem I mention on your beards, but cheap razors, they just suck. and quality does make a big difference. And the amazing thing about dollar shave club is the quality doesn't come with a crazy price tag. I mean, once you buy crazy expensive razors at the store, I still balk at the crazy price of those like ultra plastic wrapped razors. I don't get it. $5 in Dollar Shave Club gets you an executive razor, 3 tubes of shaving stuff, a scrub, shaving butter, and a post-shave dew. Yes, that was absolutely a tongue twister. They also have an oil kit and a shower kit. Those are just $5 each if you want those as well. The toothbrush is good. I had one where the bristles, they're supposed to be like this, but mine was kind of like this. So it's good that I got that replaced. Also, the shower stuff is also worth it as well. But for me, as a man with, a big bald head to shave, the razors are where I would go if I were you. So I wanted to get started with Dollar Shave Club and support today, I found out. So you can go to dollarshaveclub.com/brainfood. Get started today for just $5. So like I said, if you thought about supporting us, Dollar Shave Club is a really easy way to do that. And with that said, let's get into today's video. Alright, so contrary to popular belief, a decent percentage of the human population has known definitively the Earth was roughly spherical for over 2,000 years. This is hardly impressive as we noted in our Brain Food Show podcast, which you can also check out. These also use this fact in their own percent navigation and in communicating directions to other things. It took a little longer to realise this, with Pythagoras from the 6th century BC, generally credited with being the first known person to have suggested a spherical Earth, though the idea didn't exactly catch on at that point. Aristotle, 4th century BC, agreed and supported the hypothesis with observations such as that the southern constellations rise higher in the sky when a person travels south. He also noted that during a lunar eclipse, the Earth's shadow is round. Much more definitively, the 3rd century BC head librarian of the Library of Alexandria, Eratosthenes, built on their ideas and managed to calculate the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. How? Well, he simply used the knowledge that at noon on the summer solstice there was a well in Syene where the sun shone directly down to the bottom with no shadow. Thus, at noon on summer solstice, he used a rod to measure the angle of the shadow made in Alexandria and found it to be about 7 degrees, or about 1/50th of a circle. With this information, he now just needed to know the exact distance between Syene and Alexandria to get the circumference of the Earth, about 50 times the distance between Syene and Alexandria. Our survey crew knew to measure the distance, which they found to be about 1 so he concluded that the Earth was about 250 stadia around. Depending on which stadium measurement he was using, his figure was either 1% too small or 60% too large. And scholars think it might be using the Egyptian stadium, 157.5 meters, in Egypt at the time, which would make his estimate. Alright, so moving into the so-called Dark Ages, such outlandish ideas as a spherical Earth. The truth is, for Europe, 7th century Catholic monk and scholar, included a discussion of the nature of the world. The reckoning of time was copied and distributed to clerics across the Carolingian Empire. Later, in the 1300s, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy also describes the Earth as a sphere, and again, nobody seemed to have any problem with this. The Catholics, and later other branches of Christianity, weren't the only religious sects that seemed to have its clergy and scholars almost universally think that the world was spherical. The Islamic world also concurred, as historian Geoffrey Burton Russell sums up, with extraordinarily few exceptions, no educated person in the history of Western civilization from the 3rd century BC onward believed that the Earth was flat. Beyond the academics of the Western world, even the most educated sailor knew the Earth was spherical simply by the fact that ships disappear over the horizon with the bottom burst and then the masts are last to be sighted. A similar effect is observed when spotting land from a ship. It really doesn't take a rocket surgeon to realise that the sea is surface. Despite this, there really still is a tiny percentage of the world's population who believe that the world is flat. You might at this point be wondering just how many, while it's in a common sense, the reality is probably less less. Trolls are going to troll. Look below for examples. As for some numbers, according to a 2018 poll run by the massive market research firm, The 8,250 responses which were have a high probability of accurately representing the wider adult populace. 84% of respondents said they have always believed the world is round. 5% stated, I always thought the world is round, but more recently I am skeptical / doubts. 2% stated, I have always thought the world is flat, but honestly I am skeptical / have doubts. And 2% went with, I have always is flat. The remaining 7% stated other sure. While the good people at YouGov certainly know their stuff with respect to getting accurate data that represents the wider populace, we were curious as to what a large sample of our audience would reveal, though with caveats that sometimes be notoriously inaccurate. But for the curious, and for whatever it's worth, our poll asking more or less the same questions received over 72,000 votes. So, what were the results? Well, approximately, here we go. 96% of respondents stated that they firmly believe the world is round. 1% went with, I used to firmly believe the world is round, but now have doubts. 1% voted for, I firmly believe the world is flat. 0% stated, I used to firmly believe the world is flat, but now I have doubts. 1% noted, I am not sure what I believe on this issue. These numbers seem surprisingly reasonable for an online poll when comparing to something a little more rigorously implemented like the YouGov poll. While our numbers skew more towards round earthers, this is perhaps to be expected given we know definitively that our audience is many online trolls who, as stated, it's on that hypothesis, actually making it seem like there are a lot more flat earthers than there actually are. We did a follow-up poll which got 4,000 votes. For whatever it's worth, in this one, approximately 9% of respondents stated, I believe the world is round, but sometimes say online it's flat. 2% stated, I believe the world is flat, and advocate this position online. The remaining 89% stated, neither applies to me. And yes, we know these numbers don't add up to exactly 100% in the case, but use polling system around small numbers, so relatively. Okay, so with those numbers out of the way, this finally brings us to who started the relatively modern flat earth movement and how on God's oblate spheroid earth this movement is actually growing in an era when nearly all human knowledge is almost literally at everyone's fingertips. The genesis of the modern flat earth society started in the mid-19th century of England. Dropping out of school at the tender age of 9, wasn't that flat, but that everything we see in the heavens is actually only a few thousand miles from the Earth, stars and all. While his ideas were absurd for an incredible number of reasons, even given the technology and scientific knowledge of his era, what Robotham had going for him was that he was reportedly incredibly quick on his feet in debates and an extremely charismatic speaker, able to twist the words even the best academics. It didn't actually matter if he was right or not, only that he was better at convincing the lay people than the academics he regularly debated, or at least good at creating reasonable doubt. As noted by a contemporary article published in the Leeds Times, one thing he did demonstrate was that scientific dabblers unused to platform advocacy are unable to cope with a man, a charlatan, if you will, but clever and thoroughly up in his theory, thoroughly alive to the weakness of his opponents. As well as making a small fortune from public speaking, he also wrote various works, including the book aptly titled Earth, Not a Globe. Robotham ultimately created the Zetetic Society, which, besides advocating for a flat Earth, also advocated that only facts the one could prove true themselves could be accepted as true. On the side, Robotham made a bit of extra money by going as Dr. Samuel Burling and making money by selling cure-alls and life extenders of his own invention. While by the early 20th century, the society started to gradually fade into even more obscurity than it already was at its peak during Robotham's lifetime, all was not lost. The truth cannot be killed so easily, apparently. In 1956, when mankind was on the verge of putting a satellite in orbit, Samuel Shenton of Dover in the UK came across the formal works of the Universal Zetetic Society, the successor to Robotham's, and he was hooked. He then established the International Flat Earth Research Society, or IFRS. This adopted some of the ideas of the Zetetic Society before it, most notably, as you might have guessed from their new name, that the Earth was flat. Of course, this timing wasn't exactly ideal, given the launch of Sputnik in 1957, which, beyond being in orbit, put out a signal that anyone with a little know-how could track, very clearly demonstrating the spherical nature of the Earth. This didn't faze him in the slightest, however. He simply noted that satellites circled over the disk of the world, and that would sailing round the Isle of Wight prove that it was spherical. Just the same for those satellites. When pictures of the Earth were taken from space clearly showing the planet's spherical nature, the man who strongly advocated trusting what you can see with your own eyes stated, "It's easy to see how a photograph like that could fool the untrained eye." When astronauts came back still believing the Earth wasn't flat, he went with the catch-all explanation for any conspiracy theory when no other suitable explanation could be thought up. He stated, "It's a deception of the public, and it's right." Despite the giant, roughly spherical mound of evidence staring the members right in the face, including the variety easily confirmed by anyone with a modicum of knowledge in physics, the society did not die completely, though by 1972 had dropped from a peak of about 3,000 members down to around 100 spanning the globe. That same year, Shenton died, and Californian Charles Johnson more or less took over the remnants, creating the International Flat Earth Research Society of America. Johnson also advocated that there was a global conspiracy with regards to the very flat Earth, not just today, but spanning millennia. To quote him, this was a conspiracy that Moses, Columbus, and FDR all fought against. Beyond that, Columbus most definitely thought the Earth was spherical, simply misjudging its circumference. And we're guessing Moses didn't have to fight anyone on this one, as the ancient Egyptians firmly believed in the concept of a flat Earth, as did presumably the Hebrews around the time he supposedly lived. So what exactly do the world's governments and campus scientists and high school physics students throughout human history have to gain by convincing people the world is spherical instead of flat? Well, Johnson advocated that this is a tool used by scientists to get rid of religion. Of course, as noted, Christian scholars throughout history, on the whole, have advocated for the very spherical Earth, and we're not aware of any major religious denomination the world over today that goes with the flat Earth model. So apparently there is no conflict. But here we guess Aristophanes must have really had it in for those ancient Egyptian and Greek gods. In any event, despite Johnson's less than compelling arguments, over time this new society actually gained followers up to a peak of about 3,500 members under his leadership. Disaster struck, however, when a fire at headquarters destroyed some of the records of membership in 1997. Ultimately, Johnson himself passed away in 2001, and the society was temporarily just as dead. All was not lost, however, as there is no medium greater than the internet of giving humans the ability to discover the truth in anything themselves, if we weren't all lazy and unlucky brains and not chock full of cognitive biases. And so it was that in 2004, when Daniel Shenton created a discussion forum home for the mostly dead Flat Earth Society, and by 2009, a new wiki website was created in its place, with the society slowly growing from there to apparently around 500 members to date. There are also many Flat Earth pages and channels on sites like Facebook, Twitter, and indeed YouTube that sometimes exceed 100,000 members or subscribers to a given page, channel, or profile, for whatever that's worth. In the latest incarnation of the society, as with their forebears, the modern group strongly advocates for only accepting that which you can see with your own eyes and prove with your own efforts. As they note on their website, the simplest is by relying on one's own senses to discern the true nature of the world around us. The world looks flat, the bottom of clouds are flat, movement of the sun. These are all examples of your senses telling you that we do not live in a spherical, heliocentric world. This is what's called using an empirical approach, or an approach that relies on information from your senses. Alternatively, when using Descartes' method of Cartesian doubt, the skeptically view the world around us, one might find that the notion of a spherical world is the theory which has the burden of proof, that's not flat Earth theory. As for the model of the Earth they go with, well, there is some dissension among the ranks over exact details. The currently advocated by the Flat Earth Society is that the Earth is disc-shaped, with a pole right in the centre of this disc, and there is an ice wall surrounding the outermost parts of the Earth that keep the oceans contained. This wall is nearly impossible to reach, owing to the fact that NASA is closely guarding it, ensuring that no one ever gets close enough to see it for themselves. NASA also is extremely active in generating satellite photos of the Earth and generating other data, all meant to keep people believing in a spherical Earth. Seemingly, the Earth thing is also the only two, clearly abandoning the company's long-held unofficial mantra of don't be evil. As evidence of this conspiracy and how far-reaching it is, they also point out on their website that the United Nations emblem strongly resembles the Flat Earth Society's view of what the Earth actually looks like. Media has clearly shown the logo design team, led by industrial designer Oliver Lincoln Lundquist in 1945, to get the memo that the true shape of the Earth is supposed to be a secret. To be fair, when it was originally designed, it was originally just supposed to be used on the badges of the United Nations or really that the Earth was flat. Fun fact though, that quiz did, however, make up for the scrub later by designing the classic blue and white heated box. In any event, this might be wondering how the Flat Earth Society believes commercial airlines and ships the world over continue to seemingly travel in one direction and manage to circle the globe. Well, this is because the ships and planes are literally circling. They state circumnavigation is performed by moving in a great circle or pole. As for how the ship and plane captains don't seem to be aware of this, in modern times it's because GPS devices and autopilots are designed so the software makes it look like the craft is circling a globe and is not continually turning slightly. Of course, it's not clear how they account for people tricking themselves when navigating before or without GPS, which has only been ubiquitous for a couple of decades or so. See our video, Who Invented GPS and How Does It Work, for more on that. This is a particularly important consideration in planes where weight and balance is always an essential consideration if one doesn't want to die a fiery death. Thus, if they were really travelling in the way that flat earthers claim, the fuel requirements would be different, sometimes vastly so. No surprise here, big oil must of course be involved in covering that one up. As for, the whole day and night thing, this is explained on their website as such. The North Pole. When it is in your head, it's day. When it's not, it's night. How exactly the light from tells these people to quote, you cannot windows on commercial aircraft. Even if they flew high enough for a person to see curvature, passengers. As halfway using telescope being able to services spinning away, the Flat Earth Society claims representing astronomical objects. The Earth is not a planet by definition, as it sits at the centre of our solar system above planets in the sun revolve. The Earth's numerous fundamental differences in centrality makes any comparison to other nearby celestial bodies insufficient, comparing basketballs to the court on which they bounce. As for how gravity works in the flat Earth model, the Earth is constantly accelerating at a rate of 32 feet per second squared, or 9.8 meters per second squared. This constant acceleration causes what you think of as gravity. Imagine sitting in a car that never stops speeding up. You will be forever pushed into your seat. Yeah, but it's not the same way. It's constantly accelerating upwards, and you're pushed by the universal accelerator. You pay no as a dark energy or etheric wind. You may have spotted a problem with this acceleration, given the polished field eventually exceeding the speed of light. In fact, if constant acceleration at 9.8 meters per second squared happens, it would only take about a year for the Earth to reach the speed of light. Well, they've got that covered too, explaining, due to special relativity, this is not the case. At this point, many readers will question the validity of any answer which uses advanced, intimidating-sounding physics terms to explain position. However, it is true, the relevant equation is V over C equals tan H AT over C. One will find that in this equation, tan H AT over C can never exceed or equal 1. This means that velocity can never reach the speed of light, regardless of how long one accelerates for and the rate of the acceleration. Anyway, as to what lies below the Earth, this is heavily disputed among flat earthers, but it doesn't really matter as you can't get there anyway. You see, to quote flat earther Robbie Davidson in an interview with Forbes, we don't believe anything can fall off the edge, because a big portion of the flat earth community believes that we're in a dome, like a snow globe, so the sun, moon, and stars are all inside, it's just very high, all inside. So there's actually no way to fall off the Earth. Given it takes only a modicum of effort to disprove pretty much everything said on their website, definitively for oneself that the Earth is roughly spherical without the trust of the scientists or the government, you might think that case in point, the no driver Mike Hughes managed to raise about $8,000 thanks to a flat earth fundraiser. Why? It's copyright. Once steam-powered rockets, launch platform cost around $20,000 and took 10 years built. With its Hughes managed to achieve an altitude of almost 1,900 feet which are kind of interesting, but nonetheless, space. Not even close. If only it was possible to build more powerful rockets, or if there existed a balloon designed to be able to soar into the heavens with some sort of device on board that could capture and store what it sees like an eye. Or, to put it simply, if a human going along for the ride wasn't a requirement to show NASA how to design this futuristic visual capture device, some sort of bird-like machine could carry humans above 1,500 feet. On that note, for a mere $12,000 to $16,000, Hughes could purchase a charter flight ticket to not only take him higher than altitudes of 1,900 feet, but also take him to Antarctica to see the massive ice wall for himself. Or if the Flat Earth Society wanted to pool together their resources for prices of about $25,000 to $70,000, they could charter a flight to the South Pole itself. Though a thing they don't tell you on the vacation package brochure is that while you can go visit the South Pole, NASA subjects everyone that does to severe mental retraining to ensure all memories of the ice wall have been erased and replaced with pleasant, but very all-free recollections. All joking and head-scratching aside, it's always important to note that many of the core psychological quirks that see flat earthers intractably convinced that the Earth is flat in the face of all the evidence to the contrary exist in all of us. Monkey brain is going to monkey brain. We further all have many beliefs we firmly cling to, just as tenuously supported by our level of knowledge on a subject, though thankfully for most of us the absurdity isn't quite so easy to spot, allowing us to safely continue to think of ourselves as superior to mere mortals with alternate ideas. In the end, we all firmly believe many things that aren't true at all, and no amount of evidence could ever convince any of us to change our minds on some of these things. Good thought indeed. So I really hope you found that video interesting. Give us a thumbs up below. Don't forget to subscribe. Please also check out Dollar Shave Club through the link in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching. Today's episode is sponsored by Dashlane. You've probably heard of identity protection, password managers, and VPNs. But do you have them? Are you using them? Well, if you're not, you definitely should be. And the best way to do that is with Dashlane, which is a one-stop shop for all of your digital identity protection needs. If all of your passwords are the same, it's a bad idea. You can use Dashlane's password manager to create and securely store complex and unique passwords, making it less likely that your accounts are going to be compromised. They also have a VPN as part of their service, meaning that you can browse the internet securely and confidently, even on dodgy public Wi-Fi. But not just that, they also actively monitor the dark web to see if your information is leaked somewhere. And go in and change your passwords before someone breaks into your other accounts that share that same password. Plus, Dashlane does what it's always done. It stores your passwords, keeps your personal data secure. It fills all of those annoying boxes for payment info or passwords for you. A lot of Dashlane is free, but there are some premium features you can buy if you want more from the service. To see if those are right for you, you can take a 30-day free trial, and after that, get 10% discount. Where I found out, Dashlane.com/where-I-found-out. And let's get into today's video because we are answering a viewer question. Think Bonner 40 asks us, why does the United States stop using units and go metric? Okay then. In 1793, noted French scientist Joseph John departed France found in Australia. His mission was to be two of the rarest items on Earth. Unfortunately, the storms pushed the ships well off course. And so it was around the time he was supposed to deliver his precious cargo to Jefferson, found himself instead at the mercy of British pirates. Being French in this situation, not exactly ideal, so at first he attempted to pass himself off as Spanish, but his accent gave him away. Tombe was eventually taken to the small Caribbean island of Montserrat, where he ultimately died before he could be ransomed. So, well, what was the precious cargo that he had decided to deliver as a gift to the United States? Well, this was two small copper items, of which only 6 sets existed on Earth at the time. They were standards that represented a meter, an and a grave, the latter being best known today as a cubogram. At the time, the United States, having already become one of the first nations in the world to adopt a decimal base 10 system for currency, was strongly considering doing the same for their system of weights and measures. The idea was to get rid of the mix of British weights and measures that were mixed with other systems that were commonly used throughout the young nation. Thus, with the initial strong support of then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and thanks to a desire to continue to strengthen ties between France and the United States, adoption of the new French metric system seemed close at hand. Along with a trade agreement concerning grain export to France, Dombey was to deliver the metre and grade standards and attempt to argue the system's merits to Congress, who at the time were quite open to adopting these units of measure. Of course, we all know how this turned out. Dombey never got a chance to make his arguments, thanks to concerns about whether the metric system would stick around at all in France, combined with the fact that trade between Britain and the US would be hindered by such a change. The US eventually decided to abandon efforts to adopt the metric system, and mostly just stuck with the British system, though the US customary units and what would become the imperial system would soon diverge in the following decades. But as more important nations came to adopt this new system of weights and measures, the US slowly began to follow suit. Fast forwarding to 1866, and with the Metric Act, the US officially sanctioned the use of the metric system in all contracts, dealings, or court proceedings, and provided each state with standard metric weights and measures. In 1876, the United States was one of just 17 nations to sign the Treaty of the Meter, establishing, among other things, the International Bureau of Weights and Measure to a little over a century later, and the fourth which seemed inevitable in the 1960 Study Act. This ended up being a 3-year study looking at the feasibility of switching the United States. The results filed a report titled America, the decision has come. This recommended that the change should take place and said that it could be done in as little as 10 years. Unfortunately, the public was largely either apathetic or strongly opposed to making the switch. According to a Gallup poll at the time, 45% were against it. This was nothing new, however. A huge percentage of the time that a given people of a nation have been asked by their government to switch to the international system of units, the general public of those nations were largely against it. Even France itself, who went back and forth for decades on the issue. Indeed, it was this going back and forth that contributed to the United States' hesitation to adopt the system in the early going. Brazil actually experienced a genuine uprising when the government forced the change in the late 19th century. Over half a century later, British citizens still stubbornly cling to many of the old measurements in their day-to-day lives, though they otherwise adopted assigned units. So why did all of these governments frequently go against the will of their people? Well, arguments for the economic benefits simply won out, as in so many matters of government, what businesses want, businesses ought, yes. So the governments ignored the will of the general public, and we did it anyway. But in the US, the situation was different. Not having the pressure from being bordered and economically bound to one's neighbours in Europe, and being one of the world's foremost economic powerhouses itself, the immediate economic benefit, it didn't seem so clear. For example, California alone, one of 50 states, if it was its own nation, would have the 5th largest economy in the world. Texas and New York State aren't far behind when compared to nations of the world's economies at 10th and 13th place respectively, let alone the other 47 states. Seeing lesser readily apparent economic benefit and not having the same geographic pressures as in Europe, in the 1970s many big businesses and unions were in strong opposition to the change, citing the cost of making the switch, and on the latter side, unions worried that such a change would make it easier to do jobs that formerly used customary units overseas, given that now such a product could be more easily purchased abroad. Swayed when the 1975 Metric Conversion Act was signed by President Gerald Ford, it largely wasn't. While it did establish a board whose job it was to facilitate the nation's conversion and to put forth various recommendations, the Act did not have an official timeline, and the switch was voluntary. Nevertheless, contrary to popular belief, in the decades since, the United States actually has largely switched the metric system, the general public, both domestic and international, seem largely ignorant of this. The US military almost exclusively uses the metric system. Since the early 1990s, the federal government has largely been converted. The majority of big businesses make the switch in one form or another, whenever possible. In fact, with the passage of the Metric Conversion Act in 1988, the metric system became the preferred system on us. The federal bill then pharmaceutical and also used exclusively in fact, and the whole order of 1893, by the pounds have all been side, nobody in the US thinks that there are food labels containing both metric and customer units. Labeling Act with the majority of states, cities also metric only. The gram is commonly used to measure everything from the amount of flour to add into a recipe to how much marijuana one buys from a shop, or where it's still illegal, their local dealer. And if you were to ask someone to pick you up a 2-liter of Dr. Pepper, or how a person did running a 10K, most everyone in the US would know exactly what you're talking about. Beyond this, you'd be hard-pressed to find a ruler in the United States that doesn't include both inches and centimeters and their common divisors. Further, in school, both customer units and the metric system are taught. Yes, while many Americans generally have little practical need to learn a second language, most are, at least for a time, reasonably fluent in two very different systems of measurement. As with languages unpracticed, however, once out of school, many lose their sense of the latter from lack of use and concrete perspective. It's one thing to know what 100 and 0 degrees Celsius refers to with respect to water, but it's a whole different thing to get what temperature you might want to put on a jacket for. However, students who go on to more advanced science classes quickly pick up this perspective as they become more familiar, and thus the scientists of America aren't at the slightest disadvantage here. All students that go along that path become just as familiar as their European brethren, if just a little later in life. So this all brings us around to why the United States hasn't made the switch to the metric system more official than it already is. Well, primarily there are three reasons: cost, human psychology, and, at least on the general public side, little readily apparent practical reason to do so. As to cost, while there has never been a definitive study showing how much it would cost the United States to make the switch official and universal, general estimates range even upwards of $1 trillion, all things considered. Why so high? Well, to begin with, we'll discuss a relatively small example, the road signs. Installing street signs is an incredibly expensive affair in many places for a variety of reasons. For instance, in 2011, the Washington State Department of Transportation claimed it costs anywhere from $30,000 to $75,000 per sign, though they later clarified that those were the worst case and most expensive scenarios, and sometimes the signs and installation can only bring in at around $10,000. Rodney Mishler of The Dot explains, installing a sign along a highway isn't quite as simple as pounding some posts into a ground and bolting a sign to it. That's why it costs so variable. There are two ways to replace a sign. One way allows us to uninstall it under old rules. The second way requires us to follow new federal standards. The old rules apply if we are just fixing something, not building something new. Installing a new sign along the road counts as fixing something, basically just giving valuable information. If we install the sign on the side of the road, it would cost $2,000 to make the sign, buy the beams and rivets, $8,000 to steel poles and concrete, $5,000 to clear brush and other landscape work performed after installation, $15,000 for maintenance crews to set up traffic cones, work vehicles, program highway signs, and spend the evening doing the work. Total, $30,000. The new rules apply if you're doing a new construction project. Costs would be higher because we would have to bring everything up to the current highway code. These often involve putting up a sign bridge, a steel structure that spans the entire freeway to hold up multiple signs. The rule costs include $2,600 to make the sign, buy the beams and rivets because the sign was bigger, $75,000 for the sign bridge, for a total of $77,600. Special ordered on a one-off variety, think a highway sign with a city name on it and a distance marker, and them often being much larger than most sign makers make, drastically increases the cost. Further, there are sometimes special features that increase the cost of the sign, and we don't really know about them. For instance, the Lex states that if there's an auto accident, if a car hits that signpost, and there's any kind of injury involved, the state is going to be liable, so we're potentially at a multi-million-dollar settlement in those kinds of situations. So it would have to be a breakaway type signpost, and it has to be specially fabricated so that if a car hits that sign, it reacts appropriately and it doesn't come down and basically take out the occupants. For reference here, in 1995 it was estimated that approximately 6 million signs would need to be changed on federal and state roads. On top of that, it was noted that approximately just shy of 3 million of the nation's about 4.2 million miles, that's 6.8 million kilometers of public roads, are actually local, with an uncertain number of signs in those regions that need to be changed. That said, the rather obscene costs quoted by the aforementioned Washington State DOT would likely be grossly overestimated on a project such as this, with prices massively reduced if special laws were passed to remove much of the red tape, and given the extreme bulk orders that would be called for here, including for the signs themselves and contracts that would be produced and make this happen as fast as possible. For For example, in 1995, Alabama estimated that they could swap out all of the signs on federal highways for a mere $70 per sign, which is $120 in today's money on average. Perhaps a better rubric would be looking at Canada's switch, swapping out around 250,000 signs on their 300,000 miles, that's 482,000 kilometers of road. Total reported cost, only a little over $13 billion, which is about $61 million today, or around $244 per sign in today's dollars. Extrapolating that out to the minimum 6 million signs, that would then cost approximately $1.5 billion, plus whatever additional signs need to be swapped out on the 3/4 of all the rest of the roads that are not accounted for in that 6 million sign estimate. Not an insignificant sum, but also relatively trivial for the US taxpayer to cover about $5 per person, plus some uncertain amounts of the local road signs that need to be changed. Moving on to far greater expenses. Infrastructure. While it's impossible to accurately estimate the cost of such change to American businesses as a whole, we do get a small glimpse of the issue when looking at a NASA report studying the feasibility of swapping the shuttle program to full metric. They determined the price tag would be a whopping $370 million for that project alone at the time, so they decided it wasn't worth the cost for little practical benefits. Now extrapolating out to approximately 28 million businesses in the United States, their software, their records, their labels, their machinery, employee training, etc., needing switching would be like some sort of Y2K event on steroids. Therefore, while it's not really possible to tell for sure, many estimate that it could swell into the region of hundreds of billions of dollars and maybe into trillion territory. At this point, even the most ardent supporter of the metric system in the United States may be rethinking whether it'd be worth it to make the switch more official than it already is. But do not fret, metric supporters the world over. To begin with, the raw cost of making the switch doesn't actually tell the whole story here. In fact, it tells a false story. While the gross total of making the change would be astronomical, it turns out the net cost likely would be much or anything at all. For example, average Australian businesses saw a 9 to 14% boost directly contributed to the switch when they made it. Back in the United States, when companies like IBM, GM, Ford, and others spent the money to make the change, they universally found that they made a point of doing this. This was largely from being able to reduce warehouse space, equipment needs, streamline production, lower necessary inventories, as well as taking the opportunity to, at the same time, remove inefficiencies that crept into their respective businesses with regard to these systems. They were also able to more uniformly manage their businesses abroad and domestic to the same standards and systems. As a very small example, GM reported they were able to reduce its number of fan belts that they had to manufacture and stock from about 900 sizes to 100, thanks to everything that went with the switch. In some cases, the businesses also noted new international markets opening up, both in sales and ability to more easily and often more cheaply acquire product abroad. All of this resulted in a net profit extremely quickly from investing the money into making the switch. As you might expect from these types of benefits, an estimated 30% of businesses in the United States have largely already switched to metric. Granted, these are generally large companies and various small businesses dealing locally might not see such a benefit. However, with the increasing globalization of supply chains, many small businesses would likely still see some benefit. Unfortunately, particularly when it comes to construction, that general industry has lagged well behind others in switching, and as you might imagine, the existing infrastructure of the nation, from roads to bridges to homes to drill bits to screws to the architectural plans, for all of this being based on customary units, would not be cheap to change, and it isn't clear what the cost would be. However, as in all of this, the cost could potentially be mitigated by a slow phase-out approach with grandfathering allowed, similar to what other nations did, though in most cases on a vastly smaller scale than would be seen in the United States. All this said, we here at Today found out we'd like to posit that what the international community actually finds irksome about the United States not using the metric system is not United States businesses who deal abroad, or United States scientists, or even the government, all of which largely use the metric system, and all of which have little bearing on what Pierre, sitting in his mother's basement in France, is doing at a given moment. No, what upsets Pierre is that the US general populace does not use the metric system in their day-to-day lives. Why is this irksome? Well, beyond just the human drive for uniformity amongst one's community, in this case of the global variety, because English websites the world over keep to get some of those sweet US advertising dollars catered to the US audience and use the units that said audience is more familiar with. Those who are not familiar are often left to Google a conversion to the units that they are familiar with. The alternative is for said websites to include both, but that often makes for a break in the flow of content, something we here at Today found out regularly wrestle with to find a proper balance. So this brings us around to the human side of the argument. To begin with, while the United States would unequivocally see many benefits to joining the rest of the world in some good old-fashioned metric loving, as you might expect, given the lack of immediately obvious benefits to the layperson, few among the American public see much point. After all, what does it really matter if a road sign is in kilometers or miles, or if one's house is measured in square feet or square meters? While alongside the benefits of ease of conversion to other units in the given system in day-to-day life, this is almost never a thing that's cumbersome in the slightest, because Americans would be clamoring to make the change. The argument that ease of conversion between the units should be a primary driver for the public to want to change simply doesn't hold water in an era where, on the extremely rare occasion people actually need to make such a precise conversion in day-to-day life, they're little more than to say, "Hey Google." And in most cases, even that isn't necessary when you're reasonably familiar with the given system. Perhaps a poignant example of how, when you're familiar, a non-base 10 system of measure really isn't that complicated to deal with in day-to-day matters, consider that the world still uses 1,000 milliseconds in a second, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 24 hours in a day. What few people realize about this is that the original metric system actually attempted to simplify this as well, dividing the day into 10 hours with 100 minutes in each hour. Unfortunately, most people didn't see the benefit in switching when also factoring in having to swap out their existing clocks. Nobody has much seen a need to fix the issue since, not even the most ardent champion of the metric system for its ease of conversions compared with imperial or customary units. And while you might still be relatively stubborn of Americans for not seeing the genuine benefits to themselves that would likely be realized here, we should point out that virtually every nation in the world that uses the metric system has pulled over units still relatively commonly used among lay people that aren't metric, for simple reasons of not seeing a reason to stop, from calories to horsepower to knots to light years and many more. Or how about, have you ever flown in a plane almost anywhere in the world? Well, congratulations, you've in all likelihood unwittingly been supporting the use of something other than the metric system. You see, the pilots aboard, from French to American, use a feet-based flight level system for their altitude and not to measure their speed. Just two standards that, much like the American public and their road signs, nobody has seen much practical reason to change. Now to more concrete human psychology for not making the switch, which has gradually been converting more and more Americans from general apathy to the anti-switch crowd as the decades pass. When one group of humans tells another what to do, occasionally using terms like idiot units and starting flame wars in comments of every website or video posted on the web that uses or discusses said units, you will universally get resistance, if not outright hostility in response. This is not an American thing, as so often purported. This is a human thing. Trying to force the French government to mandate by law that French is dead and English is now to be universally spoken for the sake of better international trade, economics and relations is not going to go down well. You might argue that in a not insignificant percentage of the world, English is already the standard in such international business dealings, but that is really little different than the current situation in business in the US concerning the metric system. What we're talking about is how the general populace of France would react if the government mandated such a change, and even more so if outside nations were pressuring it. Again, it's not an American thing, it's a human thing. Beyond that, as everyone who's ever done anything online is well aware of, humans hate change. They know this, in fact. Make a change to, say, the format or style of a video, no matter how small, and rest assured that no matter if the change is unequivocally vastly superior, and the audience universally comes to agree with that, a not insignificant number of one's audience will complain, sometimes vehemently. More directly, we see this again and again throughout the history of various nations making the change to SI. Again, resistance to change is not an American thing, it's a human thing. But fret not, world. You see, slowly but surely the United States has been converting to metric, and for most practical purposes for those outside of the United States, other than having to see it on websites, which again we posit as the real driver of people's ire the world over, the switch has already been made. So much so that at this stage, while the cars made in America may say miles per hour on the speedometer, the makers of those cars are using metric to measure and build things. The very military that defends America's right to use freedom units has long since largely converted to the unfree variety. In the end, money talks, and for much the same reason other big holdouts like the UK ultimately gave in, as American businesses who have an interest in dealing internationally continue to make the switch, they are seeing to it that the metric system more and more creeps into the daily lives of Americans. This will only continue until the inevitable complete adoption. Slowly but surely, America is inching towards metric, largely without anyone domestic or abroad noticing. If you want to make the switch last longer, well, continue calling them idiot units. A mildly humorous statement from a certain point of view, given that it takes more brain power to use customary units to metric, making the latter far more tailored to idiots. Also, continue to start flame wars in comments comprising mostly of personal attacks rather than using the many and very legitimate and rational arguments that exist as to why it would be of benefit to the people of the United States to make the switch. In the end, we all know there is no better way to convince someone to do something than making the whole thing a religious war, with you on one side and them on the other. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe. Also, please do check out our sponsor, Dashlane, link below, and I'll see you next time. This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Brilliant believe that learning math, science, and computer science doesn't have to be dull. To that end, they put together courses that are all about storytelling, interactive challenges, and solving problems. It's a hands-on approach that is really an excellent way to learn, and currently they have over 50 interactive courses. Brilliant, they're a great way to take your learning further. For example, there's a course on scientific thinking, allowing you to get a solid foundation in physics while just doing some puzzles. You'll get to understand the physics of things like mirror reflections and laser tag, and also love laser tag, as well as much, much more. So effective learning is all about problem solving, and Brilliant help you to learn and practice that. It's just a great compliment to videos like this. I mean, it's all good to learn something there, but you can take it a step further with Brilliant. So if you want to support Today I Found Out and get unlimited access to all of Brilliant's in-depth maths and science courses, you can head over to brilliant.org/brainfood and you'll get 20% off their annual premium subscription. So the universe has been finding ways to mess with people long before Edward A. Murphy uttered his famed statement in the aftermath of Dr. John Paul Stapp strapping himself onto a rocket-powered sled. One of the earliest instances of this law being stated explicitly happened in 1877 when Alfred Holt, in an address to the Institution of Civil Engineers, said, "It is found that anything that can go wrong at sea generally does go wrong sooner or later." By 1908, it had become a well-loved maxim among magicians as well, as explained by Neville Maskelyne in The Magic Circular. It reads, "It is an experience common to all men to find that, on any special occasion, everything that can go wrong will go wrong." This was reiterated by Adam Holt-Schurk in The Sphinx in 1928, where it reads, "It is an established fact that in 9 cases out of 10, whatever can go wrong in a magical performance will do so." So this all brings us to our unsung hero of the hour, Dr. John Paul Stapp, a man whose work has saved hundreds of thousands of lives since, and who Joseph Kittinger, who famously did a high-altitude jump from 102,800 feet, called the bravest man I've ever met. He knew the effects of what he was getting himself into, and he never hesitated. Born in Brazil, the son of American missionaries there, Stapp eventually became an English major in college, but he changed career paths due to a traumatic incident that occurred during his Christmas break in 1928 when a 2-year-old cousin of his was severely burned in a fireplace. Stapp helped to try and nurse the child back to health, but efforts failed, and 63 hours after getting burned, the toddler died. Said Stapp, "It was the first time I had ever seen anyone die. I decided right then I wanted to be a doctor." Unable to afford to go to medical school initially, after he earned a master's degree in zoology, he instead started teaching chemistry and zoology at Electoral College in Texas while he saved up money. 2 years later, he attended the University of Texas, where he got a PhD in biophysics. Next up, he went to the University of Minnesota Medical School and got a Doctor of Medicine degree while working as a research assistant there. Initially planning on becoming a pediatrician, Stapp changed career paths after joining the Army Medical Corps during World War II. While working as a flight surgeon, among other things, he was heavily involved in designing high-altitude oxygen systems, as well as studying the effects of high altitude and high-speed flight on the human body. The end goal of all of this was to create better safety systems for pilots. During this time, he became puzzled at how some people would survive crashes, even extreme ones, while others in similar or lesser crashes would receive fatal injuries. This all brings us around to Project MX-981, which took place at the Edwards Air Force Base in 1945. Up until this point, the prevailing theory was that a human body could not withstand more than 18 Gs of force without suffering a fatal injury. The problem here was that airplanes of the age were flying faster and higher than ever before. As such, the military wanted to know if their pilots could safely eject at these high velocities without being killed, as well as trying to design the safest systems possible for that ejection. Testing towards this end was overseen by Dr. Stapp using a rocket-powered sled called the G-Whiz. This was placed on rails on a 2,000-foot track, at the ends of which was an approximately 50-foot-long section where a hydraulic braking system would stop the 1,500-pound sled in its tracks. The passenger aboard the car was initially to be a 185-pound dummy named Oscar 8-Ball and then later chimpanzees. Stapp, however, had other ideas. He wanted to see what an actual human could handle, stating of Oscar 8-Ball at the project's onset, "You can throw this away, I'm going to be the test subject." David Hill, who was in charge of collecting the test data throughout the experiments and making sure all the telemetry gear stayed working, said, "We had a lot of experts come out and look at our situation, and there was a person from MIT who said, if anyone gets 18 Gs, they will break every bone in their body." That was kind of scary. Dr. Stapp, however, used his extensive knowledge of human physiology, as well as analysing various crashes where people must have survived more than 18 Gs of force, and determined the 18 G limit was absurdly low if a proper restraint system was designed and used. That said, Dr. Stapp, he wasn't stupid, but rather was an excellent and meticulous researcher who would soon earn the nickname the Careful Daredevil. Thus, step one was to first design a proper restraint system and work out the kinks in the testing apparatus. Towards this end, they conducted nearly 3 dozen trial runs using the dummy, which turned out to be for the best. For example, in test run number 1, both the main and secondary braking systems didn't work, owing to the triggering teeth breaking off, and instead of stopping, G-Whiz and Oscar 8-Ball shot off the tracks and off into the desert. Funny enough, after the teeth were beefed up, the braking cams engaged, but they themselves immediately broke. In yet another catastrophic failure, the forces were so extreme that Oscar actually broke free from his restraints. The result was his rubber face literally being ripped off thanks to the windscreen in front of his head. As for the rest of his body, he went flying through the air well over 700 feet, about 200 meters from where the G-Whiz stopped. So this brings us about 2 years into the project on December 10th, 1947, when Dr. Stapp decided it was his turn to be the dummy. Initially strapping himself in facing backwards, a much safer way to experience extreme G-forces, the first run with a human aboard was a rather quaint 10 Gs during the braking period. After this, they continued to improve the restraint system as Dr. Stapp slowly ramped up the Gs all the way to 35 within 6 months of that first run. He stated of this, "The men at the mahogany desks thought that the human body would never take 18 Gs. Here we were, taking twice that with no sweat." And by no sweat, of course, he meant that through the tests, he'd suffered a hemorrhaged retina, fractured rib, lost several fillings from his teeth, got a series of concussions, cracked his collarbone, developed an abdominal hernia, developed countless body blisters caused by sand hitting his skin at extreme velocities, severe bruising, shattered his wrists, and fractured his coccyx. So, as you can see, definitely no sweat. While recovering, if further tests were needed in the interim, he did begin allowing other volunteers to do the job, but as soon as he was healthy again, Dr. Stapp was back in the seat instead. One of his co-workers on the project, George Nichols, stated that Stapp couldn't bear the idea of someone being seriously injured or killed in experiments that he was conducting, so whenever possible, he made himself the guinea pig. Of course, in order for the research to be as useful as possible and for other scientists to believe what Dr. Stapp was managing to endure, extremely accurate sensors were needed, which is where one Captain Edward A. Murphy comes in. For a little background on Murphy, beyond very briefly helping out on this project, the highlights of his career included working on the SR-71, the XB-70 Valkyrie, X-15 rocket plane, and helping to design the life support system for the Apollo missions. So, yes, quite the CV. Going back to Dr. Stapp's project, at the time Murphy was working on a separate project at Wright Field involving centrifuge, including designing some new sensor systems in the process. When Dr. Stapp heard about this, he asked Murphy if he wouldn't mind adapting the sensors for use in Project MX-981, to which Murphy happily replied. More
specifically, Murphy's sensor system would allow them to directly measure the G-forces on the passenger rather than relying on measuring the G-forces on the sled body itself. So before we go any further, we should point out that the exact details of what occurred over the 2 days Murphy was directly involved in the project have been lost to history, despite many first-hand accounts from several people. You might think it would make it easy to sort out given this, but human memory being what it is, the accounts from those who were there, they do vary considerably. Illustrating this point in the most poignant way possible, we have a quote from Chuck Yeager, who was good friends with Dr. Stapp. In the quote, Yeager was responding to the widely reported idea that Yeager had sought out Dr. Stapp to clear him for his famous flight where he broke the sound barrier. As to why he chose Dr. Stapp, Yeager supposedly felt that no other doctor but Stapp would clear him on account of Yeager's supposedly broken ribs. Yeager's response to this almost universally reported story is as follows: "That's a bunch of crap. That's the way rumors get started by these people who weren't even there." He goes on, "That's the same kind of crap you get out of guys who were not involved and came in many years later. It's just like Tom Brokaw's book, if you'll pardon the analogy here, about the best of breed or something like that. Well, every guy who wrote a story about World War II did it 50 years after it happens. I'm a victim of the same damn thing. I tell it the way I remember it, and that's not the way it happened. I go back and I read a report that I did 55 years ago, and I say, I better tell that story a little bit different. Well, that's human nature. You tell it the way you believe it. That's not necessarily the way that it happened. There's nothing more true than that." During this impressive and extremely accurate rant about how difficult it is to get an accurate report of some historic events, even from those who were there, he notes of those writing about these things after, "Guys become, if you'll pardon my expression, sexual intellectuals." You know what the phrase is for that? Sexual intellectuals. They're know-it-alls. That's what. And look, we're not going to lie here, we mostly just included that little anecdote because we're pretty sure sexual intellectuals, know-it-alls, is the greatest description of the staff and subscribers of Today I Found Out that we've ever come across, and we kind of wish we'd named the channel that, although we're pretty sure we're going to make a t-shirt of it at least at some point. In any event, that caveat about the inherent inaccuracy of reporting history out of the way, this finally brings us around to the story of how Murphy and his law became a thing. The general story that everybody seems to agree on is that Murphy or another worker there installed Murphy's sensors, and then a chimpanzee was strapped into the sled to test them out. Note here that years later, in an interview with People magazine, Murphy would claim it was Dr. Stapp that was strapped in. After the test run, however, they found that the sensors hadn't worked at all, meaning the whole expensive and dangerous test had been for nothing. As to exactly why the sensors hadn't worked, there are a few versions of this tale. As for the aforementioned David Hill, he states that it was one of his own assistants, either Jerry Holidor or Ralph DeMarco, if you can remember which, who installed the sensors incorrectly. As Hill explained in an interview with Nick T. Spake, author of the book History of Murphy's Law, if you take those two over here and add them together, you get the correct amount of G-forces. But if you take these two and mount them together, one cancels the other one out, you get 0. George Nichols, however, claims that Hill and DeMarco had both double-checked the wiring beforehand, but had missed that it had been wired up backwards. That said, Nichols stated it wasn't DeMarco nor Hill's fault, as the wiring had been done back at right field by Murphy's team. Said Nichols, when Murphy came out in the morning and we told him what happened, he was unhappy, stating, "If that guy, his assistant, has any way of making a mistake, he will." Nichols, however, blames Murphy, as Murphy should have examined the sensor system beforehand to ensure that it had been wired correctly, as well as tested the sensors before they were ever installed on the sled, and on top of it all, should have given them time to test everything themselves before any life from on the sled. However, as Murphy was only going to be there for 2 days, it supposedly rushed them. Nichols stated this inspires the team to not repeat Murphy's mistakes. Said Nichols, "If it can happen, it will happen. So you've got to go through and ask yourself, if this part fails, does this system still work? Does it still do the function it is supposed to do? What are the single points of failure?" Murphy's Law established the drive to put redundancy in, and that's the heart of reliability engineering. He also claimed this ultimately morphed into the mantra among the group of, if anything can go wrong, it will. As for Murphy himself, years later in an interview with People magazine, he would state that what he originally said was, if there's more than one way to do a job, and one of those ways will result in disaster, then somebody will do it that way. He then claimed when Dr. Stapp heard this directly after the failed sled run, he shortened it and called it Murphy's Law, saying, "From now on, we're going to have things done according to Murphy's Law." In yet another interview, it's an entirely different picture than accounts from Hill and Nichols, stating he'd sent the sensors and gone there to investigate when they'd malfunctioned. He stated when he looked into it, they could very accurate drawings of the thing for them and discussed it with the people who were going to make them, but I hadn't covered everything. I didn't tell them that they had positively to orient them in only one direction. So I guess about that time I said, well, I really have made a terrible mistake here. I don't cover every possibility. And about that time, Major Stapp says, well, that's a good candidate for Murphy's Law. I thought he was going to court-martial me. That's all he said. Murphy then went on to explain to the interviewer that he actually didn't remember the exact words he said at the time, noting, I don't remember. It happened 35 years ago, you know. This might have you wondering how exactly this statement that nobody seemed to be able to remember clearly came to be so prevalent in public consciousness. Well, it turns out, beyond being incredibly brave, brilliant, and hell-bent on saving lives, even if it cost him his own, Dr. Stapp was also hilarious from all accounts of people describing him. He even wrote a book with jokes and various witty sayings called For Your Moments of Inertia. For example, I'm as lonely as a cricket with arthritis, or better a masochist than ever been kissed. Or how about this gem from an interview where he was asked about any lasting effects on him as a result of the experiments. Dr. Stapp Riley responded, the only residual negative effect was all the lunches and dinners I have to go to now. Beyond this, he was also a collector of laws, even coming up with one of his own. Stapp's Law, the universal aptitude for ineptitude, makes any human accomplishment an incredible miracle. When collecting these laws, he would name them after the person he had heard them from, though often rewording them to be more succinct, which, for whatever it's worth, seems to align most closely to Murphy's own account of how his law came about. And as for this then becoming something the wider public found out about, during one of his interviews about the project, Dr. Stapp was asked, how is it that no one has been severely injured or worse during your tests? It was clear that Stapp stated he wasn't too worried about it because the entire team adhered to Murphy's Law. He then explains that they always kept in mind that whatever could go wrong would, and thus extreme effort was made to think up everything that could go wrong and fix it before the test was actually conducted. Going back to project NX981, having now reached 35 Gs after 26 runs by himself and several others by 11 volunteers, Dr. Stapp needed a faster sled. After all, at this point, humans were flying at supersonic speeds, and whether or not they could survive ejecting at those speeds did need to be known. Enter the sonic winds at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. This sled could use up to 12 rockets capable of producing a combined thrust of 50,000 pounds, resulting in speeds as high as 750 miles per hour. The braking could then be varied by raising or lowering the water level slightly. This now brings us to December the 10th, 1954, when Dr. Stapp would pull off his most daring and his final experiment. Previous to this run, Dr. Stapp stated, I practiced dressing and undressing with the lights out, so if I was blinded, I wouldn't be helpless. He assumes that he would probably be blind afterwards if he survived at all. He would also state, when he was sitting there waiting for the rockets to be fired, I said to myself, Paul, it's been a good life. In order to stop his arms and legs from flapping involuntarily in the wind during the test, they were securely strapped down and a mouthguard was inserted to keep his teeth from breaking off. All set, he then blasted off on his 29th and final sled run using 9 solid fuel rockets capable of producing 40,000 pounds of thrust. As an interesting aside here, the on-ground-based cameras, none other than Joe Kittinger, piloted a T-33 overhead with a photographer in the back filming it. As for the sled, it accelerated from 0 up to 613 miles per hour, that's 1,017 kilometers per hour in a mere 5 seconds, resulting in about 20 Gs of force on the acceleration phase. Then, in the span of just 1.4 seconds, he came to a full stop, experiencing 46.2 Gs of force in the other direction, meaning his body weighed almost 7,000 pounds at the peak G-force. In the process, he also set the record for the highest land speed of any human. Said Kittinger, watching this, he was going like a bullet. He went by me like I was standing still, and I was going 350 miles per hour. I thought that sled is going so damn fast, the first bounce is going to be Albuquerque. I mean, there was no way on God's earth that sled could stop at the end of the track. No way. He stopped in a fraction of a second. It was absolutely inconceivable that anybody could go that fast and then just stop and survive. Nevertheless, when he was unstrapped from the chair, Dr. Stapp was alive, but as Nichols would observe, his eyes had hemorrhaged and were completely filled with blood. It was horrible, absolutely horrible. As for Dr. Stapp, he would state it felt like being assaulted in the rear by a fast freight train, and that on the deceleration phase, I felt a sensation in the eyes somewhat like the extraction of a molar without anesthetic. He also had cracked some ribs, broken his wrists, and had some internal injuries to his respiratory and circular systems. And on the note of his eyes, he was initially blind after it was assumed that his retinas had detached. However, on investigation, it was determined that they had not, and within a few hours his sight had mostly come back, with minor residual effects left on his vision that lasted for the rest of his life. Apparently not knowing when to quit once he had healed up, he planned yet another experiment to really see the limits of human endurance by strapping himself to that same sled and attempting to reach 1,000 miles per hour this time. I took my risk for information that will always be of benefit. Risks like those are worthwhile. To lead up to this, he conducted further experiments, going all the way up to 80 Gs with a test dummy, at which point the sonic wind ripped off the tracks and was damaged. It was probably for the best that it was here that Superior stepped in. As you might imagine, given his end goal was seemingly to figure out the extreme upper limit of G-forces a human could survive with a perfected restraint system, and to use himself as the guinea pig until he found that limit, Dr. Stapp had previously run into the problem of his superiors ordering him to stop and instead to use chimpanzees exclusively. But while he did occasionally use chimpanzees, he went ahead and ignored the direct order completely. After all, he needed to be able to feel it for himself, or to be able to talk to the person experiencing the effects of the extreme Gs to get the best possible data. And of course, there was no better way to find out what a human could take than, well, using a human. Rather than getting in trouble, he ultimately got a promotion thanks to the extreme benefits of his work. However, after his 46.2 G run, they decided to shut the experiment down altogether as a way to get him to listen. After all, he had already achieved the intended goal of helping to develop better restraint and ejection systems, and proved definitively that a human could survive ejecting at the fastest speeds aircraft of the day could travel. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, that's all rather impressive, but that's not Dr. Stapp helping to save hundreds of thousands of lives, as we stated before. So, well, how did he do that? Well, during the experiments, Dr. Stapp became acutely aware that with a proper restraint system, most car accidents should be survivable, yet most cars of the age didn't have any restraint system whatsoever. They were also generally designed in ways to maximize injury in a crash, with unforgiving surfaces, strong frames, and bodies that would not crumple on impact. Further, there were additional issues like doors that would pop open in a crash and would fling the occupants out. In fact, Dr. Stapp frequently pointed out to his superiors that they lost about as many pilots each year due to car accidents as they did in the air. So while developing great safety systems in the planes is all well and good, they'd save a lot of lives simply by installing a restraint system into all of the cars of their pilots and then requiring them to use it. The military didn't take this advice, but Dr. Stapp wasn't about to give up. After all, tens of thousands of people each year in the US alone were dying in car accidents, and he felt that they shouldn't. Thus, in nearly every interview he gave about his famous experiments, almost from the very beginning of the project, he would inevitably guide the conversation around the benefits of what they were doing if adopted in automobiles. Not stopping there, he went on a lifelong public campaign talking to everyone from car manufacturers to politicians, trying to get it to be a requirement that car manufacturers include seatbelts in their vehicles, as well as sharing his team's data and restraint design systems. Beyond that, he used his clout within the Air Force to convince them to allow him to conduct a series of experiments into auto safety, test crashing cars in a variety of ways, using crash test dummies and, in certain careful planned tests, volunteer humans to observe the effects. This was the first time that anyone had tried a scientifically rigorous broad look into commercial automobile safety. He also tested various restraint systems, in some tests subjecting the humans to as high as a measured 28 Gs. Results in hand, in May of 1955, he held a conference to bring together automobile engineers, scientists, safety council members, and others to come and observe the tests and learn the results of his team's research. He then repeated this for a few years until Stapp was reassigned by the Air Force, at which point he requested Professor James Ryan of the University of Minnesota host the 4th annual such event, which Ryan then names the Stapp Car Crash and Field Demonstration Conference, which is still held today. Besides this and other ways he championed improvement in automobile safety, he also served as a medical advisor for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, in both of these heavily pushing for better safety systems. It is no coincidence that not long after Dr. Stapp started his campaigns, car manufacturers started installing seatbelts as a matter of course, as well as starting to put much more serious thought into making cars safer in crashes. In the end, while Dr. Stapp got little public credit for helping to convince car manufacturers to prioritize automobile safety and provided much of the initial data to help them design such systems, he was at least invited to be present when President Johnson signed the bill that made seatbelts required in cars in 1966. And now for some bonus facts. Besides ignoring direct orders to stop using himself as a guinea pig, other ways Dr. Stapp apparently used to frequently flout the rules was to, on his own time, freely treat dependents of people who worked at Edwards who were nonetheless not eligible for medical care. He would typically do this by doing house calls to Anna's homes to keep the whole thing secret, including apparently attending Chuck Yeager's sons in this way, according to Yeager. And now for another bonus fact. It turns out Murphy was also good friends with none other than Lawrence Peter, remembered today for the Peter principle. People inevitably get promoted until they reach their level of incompetence. According to Murphy's son, Robert, at one point Peter and Murphy tried to get together with Cyril Northcote Parkinson of Parkinson's Law, which is work expands to meet the time and money that is available. However, Robert claims that fateful meeting ended up getting cancelled when other matters came up to prevent the get-together. And now for another bonus fact. Another thing that Dr. Stapp pushed for, particularly in aviation, was to turn passenger seats around face backwards, as this is drastically safer in crashes. This would be something very easy to do on a commercial airline, requiring no other modification than simply turning the seat around on its track. As Stapp and subsequent research by NASA shows, humans can take the most G-forces and receive fewer injuries overall with eyes back force, where the G-forces are pushing you back into your seat, with the seat cushions themselves also lending a hand in overall safety. This also ensures tall people won't smack their heads and bodies against anything in front of them in a crash. Despite the massive safety benefits here for people of all ages, outside of car seats for babies and toddlers, nobody anywhere seems interested in leveraging the extreme benefits of rear-facing passengers to increase general safety. And now for another bonus fact. If you're wondering about the safest place on a plane to sit, funny enough, that's the rear. In fact, you're approximately 40% more likely to survive a crash if you sit in the back of the plane rather than the front. The other advantage of the rear is that most passengers choose not to sit in the back. So unless the plane is full, you might get a row of seats to yourself. Another factor to consider is where the closest exit is. As a general rule, studies examining accidents have shown that you'll want to be within 6 rows of emergency exit to maximize your survival chances. So if the plane doesn't have a rear exit, that's something to be factored in. And now for another bonus fact. During Joe Kittinger's then record leap from about 102,800 feet on August the 16th, 1960, the following happened during the ascent. At 43,000 feet, I find out what can go wrong. My right hand does not feel normal. I examine the pressure glove. Its air bladder is not inflating. The prospect of exposing the hand to the near vacuum of peak altitude causes me some concern. From my previous experiences, I know that the hand will swell, lose most of its circulation, and cause extreme pain. I decide to continue the ascent without notifying ground control of my difficulty. Circulation has almost stopped in my unpressurized right hand, which feels stiff and painful. Upon landing, Dick looks at the swollen hand with concern. 3 hours later, the swelling has disappeared, with no ill effect. His ascent took 1 hour and 31 minutes. He stayed at peak altitude for 12 minutes, and his total descent took 13 minutes and 45 seconds, so his hand was exposed to a near vacuum for quite some time, with no long-term ill effects. For more on that subject, you can see our video, How Long Did a Person Survive Without a Spacesuit in Space? Incidentally, during his fall, he achieved a peak speed of 614 miles per hour, nearly as fast as Dr. Stapp had managed in his little rocket sled. His experience, however, was very different than Dr. Stapp's. Said Kittinger, "There's nothing you can see to see how fast you're going. You have no depth perception. If you're in a car driving down the road and you close your eyes, you have no idea what your speed is. It's the same thing if you're free-falling through space. There are no signposts. You know you're going very fast, but you don't feel it. You don't have a 614 mile per hour wind blowing on you. I could only hear myself breathing in the helmet." So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do click that thumbs up button below. Also, please do check out Brilliant. This video was mega long. Brilliant do make these mega long videos possible, so please do click below, check them out, support the channel, and as always, thank you for watching. Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Mega Projects. Just before we get started, I do want to give a quick plug to my podcast called The Casual Criminalist. Whenever I cover crimes or something dark on any of my channels, people are like, "We love it, Simon, do it more." So I thought I would do it more, but in a podcast form, because why not? We'll also have YouTube videos, but those will come slightly later. There are links to The Casual Criminalist, which runs for around an hour below. If you'd like to check it out, that would be great. It covers things like the UK doctor, who was the worst serial killer in history, that time an American socialite murdered our best friend with a car, allegedly, and totally got away with it, allegedly, and much more stuff like that. It's pretty laid back, a bit more freeform, with the occasional laugh, because isn't death hilarious? Weekly shows, wherever you get your podcasts, the links below, and let's get into it. executions are at an all-time low. Capital punishment is far less common nowadays than it was centuries ago, but for those that are executed, is it any more humane and ethical? Doctors and philosophers have asked this question since at least the 18th century, but a definitive answer has never been found out. Each country that executes has its own standard they must uphold, but today we're primarily going to be focusing on the role of execution in the United States of America. The US is not the world's foremost capital punisher. As of 2019, that title goes to China, but the situation in the US is somewhat paradoxical. As a global symbol of freedom and human rights, America's recent history of sometimes brutal executions has renewed enthusiasm for finding an ethical way to kill, as well as, eliminating the death penalty. But that doesn't seem likely. Well, let's get started. Capital punishment has been a part of the world's legal systems for millennia. Initially, execution was viewed as the only way to punish the most serious offenders. As the only practical alternative, banishment wasn't seen as severe enough for the most heinous crimes. But executions have changed immensely over the years, especially in the last century or so. You see, there are a handful of reasons that countries and their citizens seek to uphold the death penalty. For one, some people view death as the only real retribution for the most horrendous offences. They say that serial killers and other deplorables deserve punishment as harsh as the acts that they committed against others. Further, some people can't stomach the idea of spending tax dollars to keep murderers alive in jail. On the other hand, executions have been used as deterrents against the most egregious crimes. Particularly in the Middle Ages, authoritarian rulers felt that brutal and public executions served an essential role in establishing authority in their lands and scaring off potential criminals. But theories on crime and punishment have developed immensely since then, with many criminologists claiming that severe punishment actually leads to a decline in civility and an increase in chaos. Throughout this development in capital punishment, execution methods have also changed as politicians, philosophers, doctors, and others have sought more effective ways to take human life. But because of the role of executions as a deterrent, there has been a lot of disagreement on what constitutes an effective killing. The popular methods have been beheadings and hangings, as their graphic nature sends a clear message to observers. But in the past several centuries, more countries have determined that effective actually means ethical. Perhaps the earliest determination to find a more ethical way to kill was in pre-revolutionary France during Louis XVI's reign. Joseph Guillotine proposed that the French king find a method of torture less gruesome than the breaking wheel, which broke the condemned person's bones while bludgeoning them to death. The physician Guillotine didn't invent the famous French death machine, but the device bears his name due to his role in inspiring it. While France moved to the guillotine, the United States used hangings for most of the 18th and 19th centuries. But hangings were often brutal in their own right. In the late 19th century, a string of particularly cruel public hangings in New York led to an interest in finding their own ethical execution machine. So, the New York State Senate initiated a commission to investigate the most humane and practical method of capital punishment. The New York Commission determines that electrocution was the most humane form of execution, and in 1888, they built the first electric chair. Over the next 100 years, from the 19th to the late 20th century, many countries outlawed the death penalty. But America, still steeped in its Wild West mentality, focused its energies on incrementally improving executions. The electric chair became the most common form following its initial use in 1890, and remained the sole method of execution in many states before the rise of lethal injection. While electrocution is still considered more humane than hanging, decades of observation seem to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it can still cause severe pain. We'll spare you the gruesome details here. Just trust us, the disfiguring effects on the body are stomach-turning. Perhaps the mildest example of the pain caused by electrocution is that the skin and internal organs get hot enough to burn anyone that touches them, causing blistering. The last time the judge ordered death by electric chair was in 1966, but it has remained a secondary option in some states. In fact, the most recent electrocution took place in February 2020 in Tennessee, where a condemned man chose the electric chair over lethal injection. Though less common than the electric chair, execution by gas chamber rose in popularity in the 1920s when Nevada officials attempted to execute a prisoner via cyanide gas. The method was a bit flawed at first, as they tried to kill the man by pumping the poisonous gas into his jail cell while he slept, but they determined that the room wouldn't contain contain the gas well enough to actually kill him. So they constructed an airtight container within which to carry out the execution. By all accounts, though, this was not a less painful way to die. According to a doctor from Johns Hopkins Medical School, the person is unquestionably experiencing pain and extreme anxiety. The sensation is similar to the pain felt by a person during a heart attack, where essentially the heart is being deprived of oxygen. Again, we'll refrain from sharing the more grotesque details of this method, but it often leaves the dead person disfigured and in excruciating pain. Several states have found this method cruel and unusual, and it hasn't been used in over 20 years. However, as of 2015, a few states are exploring using nitrogen gas instead of cyanide gas, though only when the drugs necessary for lethal injection can't be found. Finally, the firing squad is likely the oldest of these modern methods, as it began as a common form of execution during wartime after the advent of firearms. The process is quite simple. The inmate is typically bound to a chair and blindfolded with a piece of paper pinned over his heart, giving the shooters a target to aim at. The firing squad stands about 20 feet away and uses 30 caliber rifles. At least one member of the firing squad is given a gun with a blank round, and everyone fires simultaneously to ensure that no one knows who dealt the final blow. The prisoner typically dies from a ruptured heart or torn lung, but in the worst case scenario, they die slowly from blood loss. The only state that currently authorizes the firing squad is Utah, which reauthorized the method in 2015. Lethal injection caught on much later than the rest of these modern methods. The first state to legalize lethal injection was Oklahoma in 1977 and was first used in Texas in 1982. In the following years, it became the preferred method in all 32 states with the death penalty. The method includes a cocktail of 3 different chemicals, each meant to play a specific role in ensuring that the condemned person dies painlessly and quickly. The needle is inserted into the inmate's veins, and that needle is attached to several intravenous drips. The first injection is sodium thiopental, an anesthetic which puts the inmate to sleep. Next is Pavilon, or pancuronium bromide, which paralyzes the inmate's entire muscle system and stops the breathing. Finally, the potassium chloride stops the heart. At the time it was introduced, it was seen as the final solution for humane execution. After all, if the anesthetic works properly, then the inmate should feel no pain, but there have been a whole host of reasons that keep this process from going as smoothly as it's meant to. For one, the chemicals used in the injection are banned throughout much of the world, and they have a limited shelf life. However, when they're unable to acquire the proper chemicals, they often make do with whatever untested combination they have available, and that can lead to severe complications. For instance, in 2014, the state of Oklahoma was unable to procure sodium thiopental, their preferred anesthetic. Instead, they used something called midazolam, which has never been used in an execution. The prison official struggled to locate a usable vein in which to inject the cocktail and summoned a doctor for assistance. Though technically only there to observe and supervise, the doctor stepped in to assist in finding a vein. Once they felt they had adequately struck a vein, the injection of anesthetic began. After several minutes, the observing doctor reported that the man was unconscious, so they initiated the 2 fatal injections. Except, shortly after that, the man attempted to sit up from the gurney that he was strapped to, and even uttered a few words for everyone in the area to hear. Nearly 20 minutes after the inmate had spoken, the doctor attempted to halt the execution because the anesthetic had clearly not worked. But it was too late. 10 minutes after it was stopped, the condemned man died of a heart attack. Frankly, if you want to be chilled to your bones, then search for the story and read it for yourself. It's dark and it's difficult to digest, but it also paints a stark and vivid picture of just how horribly a lethal injection can go when it isn't handled perfectly. Unfortunately, this kind of botched execution isn't exactly rare. Lethal injection is considered botched when it doesn't go according to plan in any way. Lethal injections have been hailed as quiet and painless by judges on the US Supreme Court, but that often isn't the case. In fact, a 2010 study found that almost 80% of lethal injections between 1984 and 2010 were botched in some way. Proponents claim that the number is inflated, but even the most conservative tallies place the number at around 4%. One vitally important piece has been missing throughout the last century of executions: the doctor's opinion. Throughout much of the world, doctors must take the Hippocratic Oath, an oath of ethics first widely publicized by the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates. The pledge contains many ethical standards that medical professionals must uphold. Chief among them is the doctor will first do no harm. Because of this oath, practicing medical professionals cannot design methods of execution or directly participate in them. The man who first designed the drug cocktail for lethal injection was Oklahoma's chief medical examiner and a forensic pathologist by trade. He only participated in the process because he felt that he could make executions more ethical. However, he clearly expressed that a quick and painless death is only possible when the cocktail is administered correctly. But that's not always easy. Because of the Hippocratic Oath, doctors and physicians never actually administer lethal injections. Instead, that part is done by correctional facility staff who generally lack the training that medical professionals do. Perfectly striking a vein is not easy in the most serene circumstances. To complicate matters, many inmates struggle as they are strapped to the gurney awaiting their death. What's more, many inmates have damaged veins due to intravenous drug use, making it even more challenging to strike the right vein. In many cases, botched lethal injections result from needles penetrating muscle tissue instead of veins, as was the case in Oklahoma in 2014. This means that the anesthetic doesn't enter the bloodstream, rendering it practically useless while the poisonous compounds take effect. The doctor's role is currently limited to standing on site to observe the execution process and declare the condemned person deceased. As it now stands, there is no clear end in sight where doctors could administer the injection themselves or improve the process in any way. While the recent controversies surrounding lethal injection have sparked a renewed interest in finding an ethical way to kill, there simply aren't many options, or at least there aren't many new options. Most conversations about improving capital punishment compare lethal injection to other methods discussed in this video, and they all have their shortcomings and advantages. As we mentioned, a handful of states will have multiple authorized execution methods, including firing squad, the electric chair, gas chambers. Each of these methods has been used at least once since 1999, but while some seem to clearly have less risk of botching, there is a lot of debate over whether that makes them more humane. Proponents of lethal injection claim that it is the most humane option as long as the drugs are administered properly into a functional vein. That is seemingly true, but a fail rate near 8% suggests that the process just isn't that simple. The method with the lowest fail rate is the firing squad, though it's only been used in 34 state-sanctioned executions. While technically none of those 34 have been botched, there isn't any data available to suggest how quickly the condemned inmates died. The electric chair has been used more than any other method, with a relatively low botch rate.
What went down the stairs?
Violent reactions and bodily mutilation suggests that despite being quick, the method is far from painless. As the gas chamber is clear, the cyanide gas is intensely painful. Nitrogen gas seems to be better,
It's like 2,000 pounds of shit.
immense pain.
Well, no, it looks like confetti went down the stairs, like shredded cardboard or something.
Is their famous French machine.
Oh, probably was.
The
I
guillotine
don't
was
know.
last used in France in 1977, shortly before the country outlawed capital punishment. There's no doubt that the guillotine would be a terrifying death.
Actually, I did
particularly
not know.